There was more purpose to Pearce's stride as he moved on, past endless knots of folk noisily debating politics, with passions clearly running high, judging by the flying accusations. He was seeking the first address he had memorized, accosting a number of citizens to ask directions, finally locating it in an alley that backed onto the quay past the naval basin, the loading bay at that side, with name above, firmly closed. Suspicion made him walk past the dark, recessed door of the chandler's warehouse, in case anyone he had questioned decided to follow him, curious to know why a man clearly not a local was asking, for Toulon was obviously in a highly alarmed state and likely to see spies everywhere. He waited at the far end of the alley for a whole minute, until he was sure, before making his way back and ducking into the small entrance, setting off a bell as he opened the door. The first thing to hit him in the dimly lit emporium was the smell, the hempen odour of new coiled rope, a faint whiff of tar and turpentine, overlaid with the kind of dusty ambience that spoke of long years of trading. "Monsieur?" The voice came from the top of a well-built but worn set of wooden stairs, and behind the man who spoke was an open door to what looked like his bureau, the walls being lined with sheaves of tied papers. A lantern set to light the steps showed he had jet-black hair, eyes that looked to be the same, and the kind of shaded chin that denoted a fellow who was obliged to shave more than once in each day. "I am seeking the proprietor, Monsieur Mancini." "I am he. Can I be of service to you?" "I hope so, monsieur, since you have, I believe, recently returned from Marseille." Mancini, without haste, half-turned for a second, but he was facing John Pearce in another, this time with a pistol in his hand. Slowly, as it was cocked, Pearce removed his own hand from the rolled-up cloak, realizing that it must have looked as if he was armed likewise. Besides, against a pistol, and given the distance between them, the midshipman's dirk was of no use to him. "That is unnecessary, monsieur." "Is it?" "I do not represent authority." "Your speech marks you out as a stranger. I've always made it my business never to trust strangers, especially those who may come from Paris." "I am a stranger, but from further afield than any part of France. And I would point out that if I had come here to challenge you, a delegate of the local assembly, about what happened in Marseille, perhaps to arrest you for it, I would not come alone." "What could I have done that would justify arrest? I am a ship's chandler, monsieur, as the sign outside my door tells you, as well as being a representative of the people. Is it so strange that one trader from a port should go a few leagues along the coast to confer with another?" "Only if that place has thrown out the Jacobins, raised the flag of revolt, and only if that person made overtures about the same thing being applied to the whole of the coast, including Toulon." "Go on." Ever since this mission was first mooted, Pearce had been thinking of what to say on meeting someone like this fellow, who was bound to be suspicious, bound to feel endangered by their views and actions in a country where hundreds of people were dying each day for nothing more than the supposed colour of their blood or the depth of their purse. None of the words were of any use now, in a situation where only the unvarnished truth would do, for he had no doubt that this man would shoot him if for an instant he thought him an enemy. "You will have seen the British fleet out at sea, monsieur. I come from there. Yesterday I dined on the flagship with the men from Marseille with whom you went to confer. They came aboard to ask the British admiral to take charge of the port and city. I fear they departed empty-handed." The muzzle waved slightly. "Name them." "There was a national deputy called Rebecki, several traders like yourself, Messieurs Moreau and Pascal, plus a lawyer called Monsieur Trallet. I can assure you they were discreet about you. They gave your name along with that of two others to Admiral the Lord Hood. He passed it on to me." The pistol twitched again. "And those names are?" Pearce shrugged. "You will forgive me, Monsieur Mancini, if I feel I have said enough. I will not reveal the other names even to you." You are. He wondered if the reply sounded false. It certainly did to him. Lieutenant John Pearce of His Britannic Majesty's Navy. And what is it you want? My admiral needs to know the state of sentiment in Toulon, monsieur. He was obliged to decline the appeals of the delegates from Marseille, but that is something he might not do if he received the same from the citizens of Toulon. I am here to see if such a request is possible. Mancini tried not to react to that and failed, his black eyebrows rising and half a smile appearing before being wiped away. Once he had composed himself, he came down the stairs slowly. Lieutenant, please be so good as to put aside that bundle you are carrying, so that I can clearly see both your hands. Pearce obliged, and stayed rock-still as Mancini walked behind him. The doorbell tinkled again as the man looked out, no doubt checking that the alley was clear. A second time when the door was once more closed. I think I must take you, monsieur, to someone who speaks English. Someone who can ensure you are who you say. I am at your service. We will walk close together. I will have with me this pistol, which be assured I will use if threatened. And if you are who you say, all I will have done is shoot an English spy. Might I ask where we are going? The reply chilled Pearce. Certainly, monsieur. We are going to the naval headquarters of Admiral le Comte de Trogoff, the commander of the fleet you see anchored in the inner roads. Walking back along the quay in bright and hot sunlight, the coat John Pearce had borrowed now felt like a sweaty restraint, preventing the kind of free movement that might allow him to act. Not that attacking and overpowering Mancini was an option. Quite apart from that pistol, he was still on the face of it the link to those in Toulon who might ask for British assistance. That is, unless he had gone to Marseille as a spy. These and other possibilities coursed through his mind on what was a short journey. They passed the sentries posted outside what was a handsome building of a previous age, and entered a shaded hallway with a grand double staircase in the middle, rising right and left to the upper floors. A liveried footman appeared, and Mancini, without taking his eyes off Pearce, whispered to him words which sent the man up those stairs with the kind of gait that made no sound. "Who are we going to see?" asked Pearce. "I told you, monsieur, someone who can talk to you in your own tongue." "Is that necessary?" "Very, for if you cannot speak it well enough to satisfy him, your next journey will be to the dungeons." The footman came as far as the landing at which the staircase split and nodded, then waited for them to ascend before leading them up and onto a tall first-floor doorway. Mancini was announced. Pearce was not. The man at the large French windows, wearing the pale blue undress uniform coat of the French Navy, turned to face them. Stocky in build, he wore a powdered wig over a square, weathered face, and having looked at Mancini, he turned his brown eyes onto Pearce. "This fellow claims to be a messenger from the British Admiral. He also claims to have met those in Marseille with whom I went to treat. He says his name is Lieutenant Pearce." "The name of the Admiral is?" the sailor asked in English. "Vice Admiral Lord Hood." "Of which squadron?" Pearce had to think about that for a split second, but then the colour of the pennant flying on the foremast provided the answer. "The Red Squadron." "Describe him to me." "Taller than you, monsieur, with a florid face, heavy eyebrows, and a large nose." "His flagship is?" "HMS Victory." "A fine vessel." "According to those who sail in her, sir, the best ship afloat. Might I ask to whom I am talking?" "Capitaine de Vaisseau, le Baron d'Ambert. What you say implies that Victory is not your ship." "It is not. I came from England with dispatches." Reverting to French, Pearce added, "The Admiral, noting that I spoke French with the delegates from Marseille—" D'Ambert threw a glance at Mancini, who nodded, "decided I would be able to carry out this mission without endangering myself." Mancini, still locked in eye contact with D'Ambert, told the captain in a rapid-fire way what Pearce had told him, the names of the Marseille delegates and how he had come into his emporium. "One last question, Lieutenant," D'Ambert asked in English. "What ships have you served on?" Pearce looked past him out of the open French window. He could not see the frigate from here, but it gave emphasis to what he said. "One of them is being repaired in the basin below your window, Captain. HMS Brilliant. If you wish, I am happy to name some of the crew." "The captain?" "Ralph Barclay, and when I was aboard he was sailing in the company of his wife." D'Ambert smiled suddenly and said, "His very beautiful wife. Please, Lieutenant, sit down while I call for some refreshments. Very necessary on a hot day." While pulling the silk cord to summon a servant, he also spoke quietly to Mancini, who departed as the servant entered. Wine ordered, the servant too departed, and D'Ambert sat down opposite Pearce. "I've asked the Corsican to go talk to his fellow traders and arrange a meeting." Seeing the look of curiosity on Pearce's face, he added, "We call Mancini that, for he is of Corsican descent, as are a number of the citizenry along this part of the coast. It also allows us to talk of him openly without giving away his name." "So you are engaged in a conspiracy?" "I would prefer to say we are engaged in a righting of great wrongs, whatever other people may choose to call it." Admiral Hood is curious to know the balance of forces in Toulon, who is for the Jacobins and who is against. "I will tell you what I told Captain Barclay." "He survived?" Pearce asked, as the wine arrived, a cold white from what must be an ice room, judging by the mist that coated the bottle. D'Ambert answered as it was poured, wise enough to do so in French. "Fortunately, yes, having put up a brave fight." Pearce wanted to ask how many lives had been sacrificed in that brave fight, but it would not serve. He was here for a purpose, and to that he must stick, so once the servant departed, he proposed one of the scenarios that had been discussed aboard Victory. "Do you require Admiral Lord Hood to land a force of Marines?" "No," D'Ambert insisted. But then he seemed to reconsider, and added, "That is not what I think we would want at this moment for two reasons. First, it would excite those of no opinion to resist, and that, added to those who favor the cause of Paris, might tip the balance against us." "How many support the Jacobins?" About to answer, D'Ambert stopped as the door burst open. Pearce turned to see a tall and handsome officer with a sensuous face and shiny curled hair, dressed in the gold-fringed coat of an admiral. "I heard you had a visitor, D'Ambert." The captain stood up, clearly angry. "I think good manners, Admiral Saint-Julien, mean that even senior officers are obliged to knock before barging into a room." "Shit on your good manners," said Saint-Julien, in a way that implied such crudity was normal. "Are you not going to introduce me?" It was Pearce who responded, and quickly, using the name, if not the priestly designation, of his Parisian tutor, and adding a sharp bow. "Auguste Morland, monsieur, at your service?" D'Ambert proved he was no fool. He picked up the name and ran with it. "Monsieur Morland has farms in the Camargue, livestock farms, and he has come to see if he can do any business with us." "What business?" Saint-Julien demanded in a voice larded with suspicion. Wondering where the hell the Camargue was, Pearce, thinking rapidly, replied, "Supplies of meat, beef and pork for the fleet, properly salted from my own pans and at good prices." It was D'Ambert's turn. "Monsieur Mancini, the chandler, made the introduction, and I felt it was only polite to listen, though we have good and reliable vendors already." "Do you mean the Corsican chandler?" replied Saint-Julien with a sneer, which had Pearce wondering just how much he knew. "I would remind you, sir, that Corsica is part of France." "But is Mancini Captain D'Ambert?" Throughout, Saint-Julien had not taken his eyes off John Pearce, ranging over the too-tight coat, the hat now on his knee, even his breeches and shoes. It was as if he was trying to commit everything about him to memory, and it was damned uncomfortable as scrutiny. Dambert's voice had an edge to it. "I have rarely met a man as loyal as Mancini, sir. His lineage may be coarse, but his heart is French." Saint-Julien threw back his head and laughed. "It's his head he ought to be worried about, Dambert, him and his fellow representatives. Don't think that I do not know what is going on." "I am at a loss, sir, to know what it is you are talking about." There was no humour now as Saint-Julien's gaze finally shifted from Pearce to Dambert. "I am talking about what happens to those who play at treachery, Captain. In these times it is inclined to have bloody consequences." Glaring at them both in turn, the Admiral spun on his heel and went out through the door, not bothering to close it. "It is not pleasant to serve under a man who is a pig." Spat out in French, Pearce reckoned the word cochon to be much more descriptive than pig. "I know, Captain Dambert. I have served under one." The Frenchman looked as if he was about to ask who, then thought better of it, for it was not germane to their present problem. "We must go and see Admiral de Trogoff." "Who is, I trust, sympathetic." "There are many who would happily ask your Lord Hood to protect the town, Lieutenant, but only Admiral de Trogoff has the power to speak for the Toulon fleet." As they exited and began to walk along a wide corridor, Pearce asked, "How did Saint-Julien know I was here?" "The footman would have told him. They are all easy to bribe." "Will not those same footmen tell if they see us visiting the Commander-in-Chief?" The captain replied with an elegant shrug. "Very likely. There are few secrets in this building." Chapter 17. Pearce did not find Admiral le Comte de Trogoff impressive. Small and plump, he was physically uninspiring and as evasive about his own opinions as he was fussy about his person, being a constant visitor to the long mirror set on the wall between a pair of French windows overlooking the harbour. Whenever Dambert did try and pin him to a definite, the man equivocated, saying, on the one hand, in very vague terms, that such an outcome was desirable, before shifting his ground 180 degrees to espouse an equally feeble view on the opposite. Trogoff professed loyalty to his late and murdered king, while faintly praising those who had overthrown him for bringing his country into the modern age, only then to ask himself if it was not his duty to support whichever regime was in power, leaving Pearce to conclude that if his naval tactics in any way mirrored his political wavering, then Hood, if it came to a battle, had nothing to worry about. Compared to the certainty of Rear Admiral Saint-Julien, it was not encouraging. "There are many things to consider," de Trogoff insisted, fiddling with the lace jabot at his neck, "and we must at all costs avoid bloodshed." Spoken in a worried tone, it seemed very obvious that the blood he was thinking of was his own. Dambert replied to that frustrating attitude in an even voice. "We have Marseille as an ally, other towns in the region are in turmoil, and if we in Toulon can do likewise, the rest of Provence may follow." Trogoff was explicit for once. "May, all the difficulties are in that one word, Dambert. Such uncertainty. And what happens then, eh? Do you think those madmen in Paris will just sit on their thumbs? Rumour has it that troops are already on the way to Marseille. Some call them a rabble. I would remind you that such a horde defeated a coalition of all Europe at Valmy, another that fought and won on the Belgian border at Jemappes. It is not just the sans-culottes to other fanatics. Their generals are cast in the same mould." "Both armies who have since been beaten, and I would remind you, sir, that when defeated, a number of those fanatical generals you talk about are inclined to go over to the enemy." The Admiral's eyes suddenly gleamed with fire, and he cried, "Oh, yes, they do, in order to keep their heads. Look at General Dumouriez, at the victories he won. Then he loses a battle, and what? What kind of regime is it that rewards military failure with death? No one has any faith in their revolution, certainly not I.
If I take my fleet to sea and fail, what then? Am I to be dragged in a tumbrel to certain extinction?"
Realizing he was speaking loudly enough to be heard through a 6-inch plank, and certainly through the open windows, Trogoff dropped his voice.
"They have ruined France."
Pearce bit off the temptation to point out that France was pretty much ruined before they had come along, though he would concede matters had been made worse. Instead, he took his cue from D'Ambert, speaking calmly. "Should you declare against the Jacobins, Toulon is, I am led to believe, an easy place to defend compared to Marseille." Trogoff looked at him, blinked, then went back to face the mirror, seemingly unaware that his troubled reflection was visible to his visitors.
"It is secure from the sea, for there is no fleet to threaten you if you accept support from Lord Hood. I do not have the experience to cast an opinion on the land defences, sir, as I am sure you have."
Trogoff's chin was on his chest now. He was not really replying to John Pearce, more speaking to himself.
"We have nothing to fear from the east, and if we can hold the heights and the reverse slopes of Montferrand, we are secure in the north."
Finished with the positives, he turned to address his visitors with the negatives, stating that to the west both town and port were vulnerable. His right fist smacked into his left hand, and his slightly protruding eyes seemed to jump from his head.
"Toulon cannot be held without an army."
"What if troops were available, sir?" asked D'Ambert.
"Are they?"
"That we do not know. The only person who can answer that question is out at sea blockading the port."
"The Lord Hood."
"Precisely." Trogoff looked at Pearce, who, with little choice, had to return a look that implied he did not know. It would not do to let on that Hood had declined the same request from Marseille on the grounds that he lacked the forces to hold it. "Perhaps a parley between you and Lord Hood," suggested D'Ambert, "under a flag of truce?"
"No, Captain. Saint-Julien would insist on being present. What could I say with that fellow at the table? Nothing."
"Then someone must be sent to speak to Lord Hood, someone with the power to make agreements on your behalf."
"Agreements?"
That one word was said with a furious waving of his hands, clear evidence that it alarmed him.
No, D'Ambert, not agreements. Possibilities, perhaps, speculations, but not plans."
"But you do agree that an officer of sufficient rank should talk to the British?" Stood hands on hips in a place where he could catch a glimpse of his reflection, de Trogoff answered,
"I think if an officer saw it as his duty to investigate such a thing, he would require no orders from me to do so. Do you not agree, D'Ambert?"
The Admiral could not see his captain. If he had, he would have been less than pleased by the look of despair which crossed D'Ambert's face. "I take it you would not wish to be informed, sir, of such a mission."
"What good would my knowing of it do? Why, if that were uncovered, it would only give ammunition to Saint-Julien and those who follow him."
"Then, if you will forgive me, sir, Lieutenant Pearce and I will take our leave." De Trogoff walked up to D'Ambert and came close enough to put a hand on his shoulder.
"Have a care for yourself, Captain. In these times, as I have already said, heads are at risk."
"How did he ever get a command?" asked Pearce, as they made their way back to D'Ambert's room. "The man sounds as if he was born straddling a fence." The captain flashed him an angry look. "You are, sir, talking of an admiral in the French Navy, and moreover one who finds himself in a very difficult position, one much easier to criticize than comprehend." Pearce waited until the door was closed behind him before replying to that, suspecting that pain on hearing the truth was as much to blame as annoyance. "I mean no disrespect, sir, and I am sure there are as many brave officers in the French Navy as the British." "There were, Lieutenant, there were. Sadly, most of them fled." Without meaning it, D'Ambert had answered the question. Trogoff had been promoted to command because there were few others who had not crossed the Rhine to join the émigré forces under the late king's youngest brother, the Comte d'Artois. That de Trogoff, though titled, had not done so probably had more to do with the man's endemic confusion than conviction. But with Lambert, Pearce felt that it must have been a sense of duty and obligation that had kept him in service, when common sense indicated that flight was the safest option for a man with a title. "I take it Admiral Saint-Julien is angling to replace him?"
"Lieutenant, if we do not act, Saint-Julien will take charge, even if our present commander doesn't wish it. Admiral de Trogoff does not appear to see that his head is on the block, even if he does nothing. For Saint-Julien will denounce him as a traitor as soon as he feels strong enough to do so. He will then send him to Paris and set an execution." "Can I ask, what were your arrangements to get back aboard Victory?" "A boat will come for me tonight in darkness on the eastern edge of the Grand Rade." "There are gunboat patrols out there?"
"We got through last night. That is where I landed, just to the north of the Pointe de Brun."
"Then we must go from the same place tonight," said Lambert in a leaden voice. "And I must come with you. I must find out from your admiral just how much help he can give us."
Going over to the window, he indicated that Pearce should join him, pointing out the Tour de Mitre.
"That is where the crew of your old ship are housed, officers and men. Perhaps you would wish to see Captain Barclay?"
Pearce was looking down across the harbour to where his old shipmates were still toiling in the baking sun.
"That is a pleasure I can set aside, sir, until other matters are resolved." "Your captain?"
"Barclay is not, sir, my captain."
"He asked me about our fleet, what they would do if asked to proclaim against Paris."
"You spoke to him of this?"
"I did, and I agree with what he said. If we can get the trusted men on our side, the sous officers, then it matters not what Saint-Julien does. The majority of the sailors will listen to them."
"And if we can't?"
"There will be that bloodbath, Lieutenant Pearce, that Admiral de Trogoff so fears. Now, I must go and see Mancini and his friends and tell them of what I plan to do. I have much power in the town, and assure me that the whole population, bar the odd hothead, is ready to revolt. If they are right, then it puts the odds in our favor, but we must act in concert with the local population to have any hope of success."
Still looking at his old shipmates, Pearce said, "I have a favour to ask."
"Which is?"
Taking out the purse Hood's secretary had given him, he emptied a number of gold coins into his hand. "I would like you to take this and ensure that those men working on the quayside, the prisoners from HMS Brilliant, have enough to drink and eat." The Frenchman looked down at the golden guineas.
"That will only last so long."
"If we are successful, Captain Lambert, it won't have to last more than a few days."
"A noble gesture, Lieutenant."
Pearce did not reply. How could he say he had been imprisoned at one time in his life, had been forced to bribe warders just to get enough for him and his father to eat, that he had more in common with most of those men now than he had had when he served with them on board the ship? The shaded lantern was where Pearce had left it, but finding it in the gloom of a twilit wood was not straightforward, which made more anxious and already nervous Lambert. The waiting that followed, for the boat would not enter the Grand Rade before it was safe to approach in the dark, did nothing for the Frenchman's mood, bringing forth an angry curse when Pearce suggested that he stop his pacing back and forth, since it was doing no good.
"How long now?"
Lambert demanded, having already made the point that, if they did not come soon, they must abandon the attempt. The suspicions of Saint-Julien would not be assuaged if Lambert was missing come the morning. The lantern had been lit well in advance, so that Pearce had no doubt it was working. He unshaved it a fraction to look at his watch, and although it was not yet 11, he decided to act as if it was the hour, just to appease Lambert. So they walked out from the doubtful protection of the sparse pines, and arranging their bodies so that there was no spillage, he shone the lantern out to sea for no more than 2 seconds.
"You do understand, Lieutenant, that should one of our guard boats see that light, they will probably come to investigate."
Pearce replied quite sharply, because Lambert was getting on his nerves. "Then I expect, sir, since you brought with you a brace of pistols, that you will discourage them."
"Fire at my fellow countrymen,
Maybe even men who have served under me? I doubt you will have time, sir, to ask for their record of service. I suggest at the point at which they call out in French that you shoot at them before we both run like the devil. I fear I have annoyed you, Lieutenant Pearce, but I would like you to understand that I feel uncomfortable in the role I have undertaken. I am not a natural conspirator. Which implies you think I am? I don't know what you are, Lieutenant Pearce. Under his breath, as he unshaded the lantern a second time, Pearce murmured, "Then that is two of us." "A light!" D'Ambert exclaimed, in a voice so loud it proved he was a stranger to deception. Commanding silence, Pearce unshaded his lantern again, opening and closing the door 3 times, that answered by a faint, double-pinpointed reply. "That's Trevivian." The midshipman must have had them row hard, for it was no more than 10 minutes till the cutter arrived at the moonlit beach, the men jumping out to carry the officers aboard, despite Pearce's vocal protest that it was unnecessary. "I am more minded of your dignity than you are, sir," he called in his drawling burr. "Might I ask who is the gentleman with you?" "No, Mr. Trevivian, you may not." Once settled in the thwarts, and the cutter pushed off from the soft sand of the beach, the midshipmen referred to the lucky escape they had enjoyed the previous night, clearly concerned that having made the journey 2 more times, their luck might not hold. "I fetch muskets on this outing, sir, though I will not permit their use if you think it unwise." "Never fear," said Pearce. "Your muskets will be superfluous. I think our passenger will know what to answer if we are challenged." Lord Hood was roused out from his cot, Pearce insisting that what needed to be discussed must be seen to straight away, so both he and D'Ambert were ushered into the presence of a rather irate admiral, who, being clad in a floor-length dressing-gown, lacked the distinction that went with his rank. Rear Admiral Hyde Parker, likewise summoned from his slumbers, and similarly clad, looked more suited to that garb than he did to his uniform. "Might I introduce to you, sir, Captain the Baron d'Ambert." "Captain," said Hood, his response lacking the degree of courtesy that Pearce thought warranted, so little that he spoke to the C&C quite sharply. "This officer, sir, has undertaken a hazardous journey to get here, and is engaged in a mission that, if discovered, will cost him his life. I think that, however inconvenient you find it to be roused from your bed, it behoves you to recognize that." "How long is it, Parker, since an admiral could flog a lieutenant in our navy?" Parker smiled as he replied, looking even more self-satisfied in the process. "It must be over 100 years, sir." "Then we need to see it revived," Hood growled, before, in addressing D'Ambert, his voice changed completely. "My apologies. I have been quite rightly corrected, even if the manner of it, as well as the source, is inappropriate. You must be sharp-set after your journey. Can I offer you some food?" "A glass of wine, perhaps, sir," D'Ambert replied. "I doubt my stomach would accept food." "Mine would," said Pearce, only to be told quite brusquely that his could wait. He then listened to the preliminaries, as D'Ambert sought to imply that his mission was exploratory only, and to allude rather than underline that there were competing factions in Toulon, Jacobins versus Girondists, and even those who sought a restoration of royal power. This while Hood played with various notions of what could and could not be done, none of which came close to answering what was needed. Such play-acting might have gone on forever if D'Ambert had not noticed Pearce take out and make a great show of looking at his watch. "Admiral Hood, you will forgive me if I am a touch abrupt. Lieutenant Pearce has just reminded me that time is too short for us to engage in diplomatic niceties. Admiral de Trogoff will need to know what you can do immediately, what is possible in the future, and when that may come to fruition. You will know without my telling you that Toulon cannot indefinitely hold off a siege, which must surely come at some time, without soldiers to man the defences. Are such soldiers available, and if they are, when can they be brought here?"
"There is much to consider, Captain Dambert."
"And no time to do it," interjected Pearce, though he added, "if you will forgive me." The Frenchman looked pained, so Pearce added, "Captain Dambert will not say so because he feels it demeaning to admit such a thing, but his life will be endangered if he does not return before daylight. If that is not possible, it alters everything. Indeed, it might mean the captain would be better abandoning his duties and staying aboard Victory."
"Lieutenant,"
protested Dambert, holding up his hand for what he evidently thought of as a heavy-handed ploy,
"this is not the way such matters are decided."
"I do think," Pearce insisted, "that the time we have precludes sticking to the normal rules. The captain will also not say that his commanding admiral is inclined to prevaricate, is an indecisive commander by his very nature, and will only act on certainty, not chance. He has mentioned that Admiral Saint-Julien holds different opinions, but not that he is viscerally opposed to anything that smacks of surrender, and will do all in his power to prevent it, even, if he thinks he can get away with it, to the point of arresting Admiral de Trogoff for treason. I believe the only thing that stops him from doing so immediately is that he is not sure that he can carry the crews of the ships."
"Have you quite finished, Lieutenant?"
asked Hood. "I speak only out of concern, sir, that you do not understand the currents with which you deal. And I would say that with my experience, I know more about the forces that shape revolutionary politics than anyone in this cabin. Those who must risk their lives by declaring for the cause of freedom must know they are going to be supported, otherwise they will do nothing."
"I think you have said your piece, Lieutenant Pearce. Now, if you will let me, I will answer Captain Dambert's concerns."
With that he looked at the Frenchman.
"And, of course, those of Admiral de Trogoff. Would you like those in writing?"
"Yes." The Under-Secretary, who had been forced to lend his coat to Pearce, was fetched, dressed in his shirt-sleeves and breeches, his attention at first on the state of his only covering garment. A bark from Hood had him seated, quill poised, as the Admiral spoke.
"You will not know, since the news only came to me before I retired for the night, that Marseille has been invaded by the army of General Carteau, this after he defeated those marching on Lyon, an action I must tell you I strongly advised against."
"Then it cannot be held," said Dambert, this while Pearce was thinking what a sly old fox Hood was, keeping that information to himself until it could be used with some impact. Hood nodded his head in agreement.
"It cannot. I fear for the people who live there, for I cannot imagine that there will be much in the way of forgiveness."
The Baron dropped his head, and it was obvious he was silently praying, which Hood respected by holding his tongue until the man was finished.
"But our concern is Toulon. I will undertake, on a request for support, to immediately land the Marines to the number of 1,500, to secure the heights of Montferrand and the approaches through Ollioules to the west, and I am sure Admiral Langara will do likewise. I will also land sailors to shift what guns you have in the arsenal, and set them to building the redoubts and gun emplacements necessary to hold off a besieging force well away from the town walls."
"That will not suffice, sir."
"I am aware of that, Captain, and because of that knowledge I will send for troops. First from Spain, though you must understand that I have to speak with Admiral Langara as soon as I can get him aboard. Then there is Naples. I will dispatch a senior officer to request from the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies help to defend Toulon. I expect such a request to be met with a positive, given that they will be helping to secure the future of their own territories, albeit at some length from their borders, but also because, as you know, Queen Carolina is Austrian, and a sister to Queen Marie Antoinette."
The quill scraped behind, while Dambert sat rock-still, leaving everyone else to wonder what he was thinking. Hood, it seemed, was the only one who knew.
"I see that you reckon that insufficient, too."
"Even in numbers, Admiral, I have little faith that the Spaniards and Neapolitans can hold any perimeter we decide upon. Spain is no longer the military power it was even 50 years ago, and as for Naples..." He gave an elegant and eloquent shrug to say they would be near useless.
"I agree, which is why before you leave you will be given sight of a letter I intend sending by my fastest frigate to London, asking that troops be sent with all dispatch to help us maintain not just Toulon, but to open a campaign to secure the whole of southern France."
"Does England have such troops?"
"Britain," replied Hood,
with a half-smile at Pearce, like most Scots inclined to bridle when the combined nation was not properly named.
"Our country has them available now. They are designed for service elsewhere, though you will understand discretion debars me from saying where. But I doubt they have sailed yet, and will not do so for at least a month. I am going to suggest to the government, of which I am, as the senior sea lord, a member, that they would be better employed on the coast of Provence."
"Numbers?"
"Enough to hold off and destroy by attrition an army besieging Toulon, and once that army is forced to raise the siege, enough to pursue them and detach the rest of southern France from the revolution. All we have to do, acting as allies, is to maintain the place until they arrive."
John Pearce was impressed, thinking how different Hood was from de Trogoff. Decisive, a man who could think through a problem and not only see but expound solutions. In short, a fighter and a leader who did not need to hold a conference to act. "I would be happy to take these terms back to Admiral le Comte de Trogoff. I cannot guarantee you will find them sufficient."
"And I cannot see what more I can offer. I would also add that General Carteau's army, once it has finished in Marseille, will march on to Toulon regardless of what action you take, and as of this moment, you have nothing with which to halt it."
"I know that, my lord."
"And you, Captain, what is your opinion?"
Hesitating for half a second, D'Ambert was quite emphatic when he spoke.
"I will recommend that ye accept your terms and act upon them, sir." "And the town?"
"Once they hear that Marseille has been invaded, they will have no choice but to accept. There will, as you say, be a retribution for what is perceived, let alone for what has been done."
"Good. Lieutenant Pearce, be so good as to return his coat to my under-secretary, and your hat I will see gets back to its owner."
"Sir."
"Then get yourself into uniform. You will accompany Captain D'Ambert back to Toulon."
"Why?" Hood's eyes flashed.
"First, because I say so, and second, because the terms of surrender I have outlined have to be presented to Admiral de Trogoff by a British officer, or at least someone dressed as one, and you are the person I have chosen for the task."
"Sir, I have not slept for 2 nights."
"You will have time to sleep, Lieutenant, when there is nothing to do. Now you will do as you are ordered."
Chapter 18. The news had obviously come from Marseille about what was happening there, and if half the shouted stories were true, the army of the Revolution was already in the city and spilling blood in quantity. Those on the Toulon quayside not arguing politics and speculating were going about their affairs with worried expressions, for the Revolution would not spare anyone thought of as traitorous, nor any person that a neighbour or rival chose to denounce. Pearce had seen it before, in Paris and the towns that led to Calais, that haunted look of being under threat from sources unknown. In the early morning light, the old saw, sticking out like a sore thumb, was much in his mind as, one hand clutching his dress sword, he made his way along the quay. The white facings on his dark blue uniform coat, the brass buttons polished to gleaming perfection by a wardroom servant, were too obvious to be missed, especially set against the pale blue of D'Ambert's French uniform. Hardly anyone they passed failed to notice, which led to an extra examination and excited conjecture that obviously related to his presence ashore. He had no doubt that the news that a British naval officer was visiting Admiral de Trogoff's headquarters would spread around the town like a brush fire, adding to an already febrile and potentially perilous atmosphere. Passing the same footman who had shown him to Dambert's rooms the previous day, he guessed that Admiral Saint-Julien would quickly be made aware of his presence, and it was clear from the lift of the eyebrows that the fellow recognized him, which killed off any notion that it was not part of some conspiracy. The grip on that sword tightened, and he made a point of asking his companion, once they were secure in his offices, if he still had those pistols.
"Nothing will happen to you here, Lieutenant, I assure you, for I can say you have come to us under a flag of truce."
The Frenchman rang a bell, ordered that coffee and fresh rolls be fetched, and that the commanding officer should be told that a plenipotentiary had come from Admiral Lord Hood with a letter addressed personally to him. Then he asked an equally important question.
"Admiral Saint-Julien?"
"He is not at present in the building."
"Good," Dambert replied. "Please let me know as soon as he arrives."
To Pearce's questioning look he added,
"Saint-Julien has several ladies by whom he is entertained. I suspect he is with one of them now, and since there is no alarm, and every officer in the fleet knows what to do if there is, he will not rush to return to his duties."
"Shameful," said Pearce, unbuckling his sword and stretching out on a chaise. "Does he not know there's a war on?" Under strain as he was, Dambert nevertheless managed to smile.
"I suspect, Lieutenant, that you and I would both rather be engaged in what he is about than what we are doing at the moment."
"Right now, Captain, I think I would turn down even that in favor of sleep." With that, Pearce closed his eyes and fell into an immediate slumber, one that was not affected by the smell of coffee, freshly baked bread, the clinking of Dambert's crockery, the shouted exchanges and screams of encouragement and fear from the quay below his windows, or the endless stream of clerks bringing in the muster books, stores manifests, and logs of the ships in the harbour, all of which they had checked, but which had to be passed and signed off as accurate by a senior officer. Dambert woke him after an hour of truly deep and reviving sleep, which, once his eyes had cleared, revealed a worried-looking Frenchman holding a sheaf of reports in his hand, which he shuffled through as he spoke.
"Marseille has definitely fallen, and the guillotine is already at work. Rebecki, the fellow who led the delegation who came to see Lord Hood, has apparently thrown himself into the harbour rather than face such a death. The soldiers are raping, killing, and stealing at will. Anyone prominent is being hauled to the scaffold for immediate execution."
"Admiral de Trogoff knows this?" The question was so obvious it did not have to be stated. Why had he not seen de Trogoff?
It was a weary Dambert who told him, "The Admiral first sent to say he was at his toilette, which you will guess is not of short duration, but after an hour passed I inquired again. Now he has sent a second message to say he is indisposed and would like to read Lord Hood's letter rather than meet you."
"In short, I might ask him to respond to it?"
"I fear that is true. While you were asleep, I sent a trusted man to inform Mancini and his friends of what Lord Hood proposes. I have added my own view that those in the town prepared to act must be ready to do so at a moment's notice, certainly before the day is out."
Pearce had grabbed one of the rolls and was chewing at it as he spoke. "You do not see that as too hasty?"
"What do you think Saint-Julien will do once he hears that a British naval officer has arrived here in uniform? This after Marseille has been taken and put to the sword by Carteau. The man is far from stupid. He will surmise that portends a resolution, one that is unlikely to favour him, and he will seek to act accordingly, which is what I would do. If he gathers his adherents, organizes and arms them, they will form a formidable obstacle, perhaps an insurmountable one."
"From where will the arms come?"
"Oh, not from our warships, I'm sure. The captains will prevent that. I've put guards on the arsenal, but I have no guarantee they will bar a rear admiral from entry if he demands access."
"Will Mancini act?"
"I hope so. The delegates to the local assembly are in session now.
but no news has come that they are close to a conclusion. My fear is that the Toulonnais will wait to see what the fleet does, while the fleet waits to see what action they take. You must take command of this, Captain, of both townsfolk and the sailors. The reply lacked much in the way of conviction. I am obliged to obey the orders of my superior officer, Amiral de Trogoff. Sophistry, Pearce insisted. You are telling me you are prepared to accept the commands of one admiral, while I have no doubt you would readily disobey the commands of another. Let me go and see de Trogoff. I may be able to get him to act. And if he does not? The captain turned his back on Pearce then, once more to look out over the Vieux d'Ars, to the ships being built and repaired, and the long lines of low buildings that made up the greatest dockyard in the Mediterranean, the pride of the French navy since the days of Henry IV. His voice, when he finally spoke, was full of the despair of a man forced to contemplate going against all the tenets by which he had lived his service life. Then I must do as you say, and I hope that you believe that my own fate will have nothing to do with whatever actions I encourage. I know that, Captain, Pearce replied, with genuine sincerity. Pearce was left to his own devices, and looking out over that same view that had so troubled Dambert, his eyes were once more drawn to the brilliance, toiling away on the opposite side of the basin. If things were going to come to a head, if there was a possibility of fighting and bloodshed, they, under an armed guard, must be informed, for if they were not, they could easily become victims. He was the only one who could warn them. He knew he should tell Dambert of his intentions, but since he had no idea how to contact him directly, he was obliged to pass on the information to the footman, whose loyalty was questionable. That hardly mattered. What could a footman do? Back out on the quay, hurrying along, he was again the object of much speculation. These were folk who knew the dress of the different navies, and the wheel of rumour was working flat out, promising death from any number of sources. Not all the looks were hostile. Most were alarmed or suspicious. But there was the odd fellow who shook his fist, though the hand on the sword deterred them from a more potent reaction. Unbeknown to John Pearce, that was the effect it had on Ralph Barclay, looking out at the morning view from the ramparts of his Tower prison. "Damn me, a British naval officer!" he shouted. "Captain Barclay!" exclaimed his wife. "My dear," her husband replied, for once unabashed, "if I cannot issue an oath at this sight, there is nothing on heaven and earth that will condone it." Emily came out into the open air, and following his pointing finger, her hand up to shade her eyes from the sun, she fixed her gaze on the figure in the dark blue coat hurrying down the southern edge of the quay. "That, my dear, is a British officer." "You are sure, husband?" "My dear, allow that I know a lieutenant's coat when I see one." "I merely question whether he could be from another service." "No, he is one of ours," Ralph Barclay insisted, turning to look out over the rest of the harbour and seeing no change in the disposition of the shipping. "The question you should be asking is this: what's a British naval officer doing parading about, unescorted, in a French naval base?" "The simplest solution, husband, would be to ask him." "Which I was just about to suggest," he replied. "Perhaps you would care to accompany me." "I am not sure, given you have no idea of the nature of his presence, if that would be wise." "That is clever of you, my dear. Though I can see no danger, that does not mean that none exists." Ralph Barclay was in his coat and alerting his escorts within a minute, struggling to balance his uniform hat on his still bandaged head. This as his wife watched this unknown officer make a beeline for the crew of her husband's ship. The men guarding the Brilliance were not like the townsfolk, or those sailors that had pointed at him from the decks of the vessels under repair. The man in charge, with the insignia of a sergeant on his cuff, stood up as soon as one of his underlings nudged him, the look of confusion on his face evident even at 100 paces. The musket came half up, and he called to the rest of his party to attend, so that by the time Pearce got close, he faced a line of suspicious-looking men with weapons ready to be used. "I am here under the parole of Captain le Baron d'Ambert. I have his permission to talk to the prisoners." Said loudly, it had several of those prisoners looking up. But with the sun behind him and his fore and aft hat shading his face, they would struggle to identify him. The French sergeant responded with a deeply sceptical look which matched his words. "The good Capitaine was here only yesterday. He brought them wine, food, and coin. But he said nothing to me of second roast-beef officer." The other roast-beef officer had to be Barclay, but that was irrelevant. "I think you must ask yourself why I am here without my own guards. If you do not believe what I say, you must send to naval headquarters and ask Captain d'Ambert himself. I wonder how he will take to you questioning the word of an officer, even a British one." Now all the brilliance was standing, work forgotten, staring at the scene, as the sergeant chewed on his tobacco like a ruminating bovine, wondering what to do. The man before him had walked up, unescorted, and behaved with a confidence he would be disinclined to challenge, considering the way he had used d'Ambert's name. Seeing his wavering, Pearce added, "I only wish to talk with them in the same manner as their captain." "Then you will not mind, monsieur, that I keep a musket trained on you, one which I must tell you is loaded and primed." "Not one bit, but do make sure that your finger does not twitch." With that, Pearce turned to face the brilliance, raising his hat as he did so, and watching the faces as one by one they recognized him. Costello, a dark-skinned boatswain's mate who had been kindly in his own rough manner, cried out first. But it was the open-mouthed boatswain he addressed. "I bid you good day, Mr. Sykes." "Pearce?" he replied in deep disbelief, his eyes lowering and lifting from silver shoe buckles to uniform hat. "The very same, Mr. Sykes." "Christ almighty, Pearce, what are you doing here?" demanded Costello. "And in that uniform," wheezed a less than enamoured Kemp. "And in that uniform, sir," Pearce insisted, for Kemp was one who stirred unpleasant memories, a man to distrust, and one who was too free to use his starter on a man's naked back. But he was not looking at the rat-faced sod. He was examining all the faces for a sight of Ben Walker. "Like hell I will. Hell will freeze before I sir you, 'cause you ain't no officer and that's no error. Dressed in that garb you's asking for a flogging round the fleet." It was with a certain dread that he asked, "Where's Ben, Mr. Sykes?" The boatswain just shook his head in the way that implied that Ben was no longer alive. Pearce jerked his head back towards Brilliant. "In the battle?" Sykes shook his head again, about to explain, but in doing that his gaze was directed over the questioner's shoulder, and it stayed there. This while Pearce was looking around for other faces, Martin Dent, Dysart, and Costello's best friend Ridley. The shout from behind him took him by surprise, but that was overlaid by an immediate recognition of the voice. "Lieutenant!" Pearce turned to see Barclay with two armed escorts striding towards him, steadying a headpiece that refused to stay square on his head. Again the shade from his own hat hid Pearce's face, and he waited until Barclay was really close before lifting it, saying as he did so, "Sir?" Barclay reacted as if he had been hit by a hammer, stopping dead, his jaw moving but no sound emerging, his eyes full of the kind of look that Pearce imagined a man would have seeing a ghost. The words he added had a sweet quality that did nothing to ease Barclay's confusion. "Lieutenant Pearce, at your service, Captain Barclay." "You?" "I do believe it is I." "Impossible!" "Perhaps, Captain, you would like to pinch yourself to see if you are awake." That made some of the crew laugh, a sound which had an effect on Ralph Barclay, always sensitive to the possibility of ridicule. His mouth closed and his jaw clenched, the prelude to a burst of angry condemnation. "How dare you, you swine, wear that coat? I will not ask how you got here, but I suspect treachery has something to do with it. Explain yourself." "I'm sorry, sir. I've no inclination to do that." "I am ordering you to explain yourself." "He's for it now. Kemp said, an opinion that, judging by the murmuring, was shared by quite a few of his shipmates, some of whom must have wondered at the way Pearce was smiling. "What a conundrum, Captain Barclay. You decline to see me in the rank I legitimately hold, which, if I accept your premise, makes me a civilian. As the former, I have good reasons to decline the order. As the latter, I can tell you to go sling your hook. Which is it to be?"
"I'll have you flogged for this."
"Will you? I had it in the cabin of HMS Victory just last night that it is a long time since lieutenants could be flogged by captains."
"Victory?"
"Yes. I think I upset Lord Hood, but then I seem prone to that when faced with senior officers."
"Hood is here?"
"Well, not precisely, but he is out at sea."
"Why would Lord Hood have anything to do with the likes of you?"
Now that is a question in these last 2 days I have asked myself more than once. Barclay's frustration boiled over, and he turned to the Marine Sergeant, watching the whole exchange with mystified curiosity.
"Arrest this man! He is an impostor!"
Seeing the confusion on the Frenchman's face, Pearce said, "What a pity you don't speak French, Captain. Not that I think he would obey you even if you could." Barclay looked around as though salvation could be found from a dilemma that had no obvious solution. Finally he stared hard at what he clearly considered to be a walking insult.
"If I had a weapon, Pearce, I would strike you down."
"You remember my name," Pearce replied, still in a sarcastic tone. "That is something." Then both his voice and his look hardened.
"As for having a weapon, I wish you had, for it would give me the opportunity to kill you."
Barclay screamed,
"Explain what you are doing here!"
"Sorry, sir. I am under the personal command of Lord Hood, carrying out a mission for him which I am not at liberty to discuss. And even if I were not, I would decline to discuss it with you. Please be informed, Captain Barclay, that as soon as the opportunity presents itself, I intend to challenge you to a duel. And since I have some confidence in my ability with any weapon you care to choose, I can happily anticipate that the encounter will result in your demise." He then turned his back on Barclay and indicated to Sykes to come close. The words he whispered had to be brief, but Sykes was quick to understand. Then Pearce turned to thank the French sergeant, who accepted a coin for his trouble, smiling, and totally unaware that the man giving it to him had just told the burly boatswain that if a shot was fired anywhere in the harbour or the anchorage, he should immediately attack and kill his guards. When he turned again, it was to see Barclay's back as he strode back towards his prison, at a pace so furious that his escorts found it hard to keep up. Ralph Barclay was still boiling with anger, his limbs shaking with that emotion as he mounted the stone stairs that led to the top of the Tour de Mitre, and the questioning look that he received from his wife did nothing to mollify that. His hat was thrown at a chair, and he was just about to open his mouth and tell her how much he had been traduced and by whom, when he realized that to be forthright was to open himself to a number of questions that he would not like to have to answer. Pearce had been the cause of trouble between him and his wife. Indeed, there lay the source of their first real quarrel, and he was not sure that she would, as she should, take his side. So it was with an almost Herculean effort that he steadied himself and answered the question that had yet to be asked.
"An impostor, my dear. And you know those damned Frenchmen would do nothing about it. I shall complain to Captain Dambert."
For once Emily did not chastise him for his language. Too curious. An impostor? So he was not a British officer?
"He was dressed as one, but no."
A Frenchman, then?
"Not that. I am afraid he was exceedingly rude to me, and I had to threaten him with chastisement. I am happy to say that I put the blackguard in his place."
If he is not a Frenchman, who then is he? Cornered, Ralph Barclay gave an answer he was sure was true.
"A traitor, my dear, that is who. One that I hope will hang for his actions."
Chapter 19. Like most seaports, the lanes leading off the quay were narrow, high, and heavily shaded tunnels that testified to the value of the land that edged the water, down which the wind would whistle at increased strength during any kind of blow. Pearce, striding along, was hardly aware of them or anything else, including the groups engaged in noisy and impromptu political debates. He was still savouring his encounter with Ralph Barclay, and thinking of the various ways in which he would kill him, so the two quartets of cudgel-bearing ruffians who emerged from the pair of alleyways immediately in front and behind took him completely by surprise. They were upon him so quickly he could only half draw his sword before a blow on the forearm stopped the motion. By that time his arms had been pinioned, he had a knife at his throat, and he was being dragged out of the sunlight into the shadows with a rasping voice in his ear telling him not to try to resist. If any of the numerous folk on the quayside saw what was happening, no shout was forthcoming. Bundled into a dark alley, he was pushed along, bouncing painfully off the walls, something to which his captors were indifferent. One had gone ahead, and was stood now before a low door that had a step down to a dingy interior, into which he was thrown. He landed on a bare earthen floor, the door slamming shut behind him, followed by a voice from out of the gloom.
"So you are, as I suspected, a spy."
The voice was St. Julian's, and with the oil lamps turned up, that was confirmed. The Admiral was in a plain black coat, looking with his curled hair quite the Jacobin. "I am a British naval officer," protested Pearce, pulling himself onto his knees, aware that his captors too were inside and all around him, dark, rough-looking men, but probably sailors. "As you can see from my uniform." St. Julien put a hand on his shoulder to prevent him rising to his feet. Leaning over himself, his dark eyes flashing, black hair glistening in the light from the oil lamps, the heat of the now crowded room filling Pearce's nostrils with a whiff of a strong, rather feminine scent.
"You were not dead yesterday in Damber's office. You were a Camargue livestock farmer. How do I know you are what you say you are today?"
"I am Lieutenant Pearce of His Britannic Majesty's Navy." The expression now sounded as feeble as a schoolboy excuse.
"Naval officer or farmer, you have come here for what purpose?"
"You cannot expect me to respond openly to that, monsieur."
"Of course I do, though I suspect I know the answer."
"Then why ask?" St. Julien hit him then, a swift backhanded blow that sent him onto his back. As he rolled, he landed up against the legs of one of the men who had abducted him, tasting blood in his mouth.
"Pick him up."
Two men took his arms and hauled him to his feet, and now he and St. Julien were face to face.
"You arrived this morning at the Admiral's residence in the company of Dambert, who I suspect is in league with you in an attempt to persuade Amiral de Trogoff to betray his country. In order to get him to do that, certain proposals would have had to be made, perhaps some signals agreed. I want you to tell me what they are, as well as the names of those you have dealt with here in Toulon, be they supporters of the Bourbons or those traitors who have the nerve to still call themselves Republicans."
"No." He was hit again, this time on the temple, and being tightly held, there was no way to absorb what was a heavy blow. Hurt, Pearce shook his head, which St. Julien clearly took as another refusal, providing an excuse to land another punch.
"I do not have time to toy with you. Right now I have every right-thinking French sailor, the men who believe in true liberty, gathering at the Place d'Armes in their thousands, and once I go to them, I will lead them to seize the arsenal. After that, we will take over Toulon and root out the turncoats who intend to betray us to the English, naval and civilian. What is happening in Marseille will be as nothing to what I will do here."
"The answer is the same, Admiral."
"I could hand you over to these fellows,"
St. Julien said, indicating those that surrounded them,
"and they would have great sport with you, I am sure. But that would take too long, so I must move quickly to a method I find personally unpleasant, but one that I feel is justified when the fate of my country is at stake. Fetch me a nail, a big one."
Dimly aware of the movement, Pearce was forced to concentrate on the long, sharp nail, at least 6 inches in length, which was placed in St. Julien's hand. Even more when one of the others brought forth an oil lamp, removing the glass sleeve that kept out the draught to expose the naked flame. A pair of pincers was handed over as well, and St. Julien first placed the head of the nail in the jaw of the pincers, then the point in the now guttering flame. "Distasteful, as I say, and I hope you believe me when I say that employing it will cause me much grief." Pearce was transfixed, with the fine tip turning the flame from gold to blue. "When this turns red, my friend, I am going to put it first in one eye, and then, if you still refuse to answer my questions, I will heat it again and jam it in the other." Pearce was sweating, and it was not just from the heat of the room. Fear was adding to that, for he had no doubt that St. Julien was telling the truth, except in one respect. His proposed victim was convinced that he was going to enjoy his torture. The evidence of that was in his silky, almost happy voice. "Shall I call you Lieutenant?" St. Julien asked, as the nail tip began to redden. "Perhaps, since I am about to render you useless, it would be a kindness. So, Lieutenant, before you forfeit one eye, what are the terms by which Amiral de Trogoff will be persuaded to act against his duty? Who are the people in the town who support such a move? And just how much is Dambert involved?" The sweat was running down Pearce's brow and into his eyes, making him blink. He could feel the shaking in his knees as he anticipated the pain that he would soon experience, and was sure if his captors let him go he would fall. His resolve was weakening too. Was it worth refusing to speak? What was his silence for? The Navy? His country? Trogoff and Dambert? The latter would tell him to give up what he knew. That was a Frenchman who would not see another man suffer to save himself. The pistol shot, muffled by the thick oak of the door, stopped even that train of thought. It certainly made St. Julien jerk his head to the entrance, and in the act of doing so remove the nail from the flame. Pearce observed this as his knees gave way, for those holding him had let go in alarm, something that increased as the door burst open and a musket, taking no aim, fired into the group around him, producing a thud and a curse rather than a scream, one that told Pearce one of his captors had been hit. As that musket was withdrawn, 2 pistols appeared, to be discharged as well into what was now a panicked mass. Pearce, now back on his knees, grabbed hold of St. Julien's legs and hauled hard, bringing the Admiral crashing down and sending flying the oil lamp, vaguely aware of another burst of gunfire and a great deal of yelling and screaming. But he was concentrating on the Admiral, still with that heated nail in the pincers in his hand, as that was jabbed towards him. The smell of singeing material was instant, and so was the searing pain as the nail penetrated the cloth of his coat and entered his upper arm. With his right hand he hit St. Julien in a downwards blow that jammed the Frenchman's head into the ground. Then he fell forward, and finding the jaw he bit him as hard as he could, an act which had the nail removed. Scrabbling to get some purchase, he then tried to knee him in the groin, which was only partially successful, and an attempt to follow it up was thwarted by hands grabbing him and pulling him back. The despair that flooded through him was relieved when Mancini shouted at him, telling him to stop, telling him that he was free. His arm aching like the devil, Pearce stood in his shirt-sleeves watching the confrontation between the 2 admirals. St. Julien was defiant, bruised and scarred, not from what his recent captive had done to him, but to the rough handling he had been subjected to on the way to de Trogoff's headquarters, that added to by the many stones thrown at him by those who supported Mancini and his friends, which, to Pearce's surprise, now seemed to be most of the inhabitants. Outside and below the open windows a noisy crowd had gathered, and it was obvious from the shouts floating up that they wanted St. Julien strung up on the nearest warehouse hoist.
"You have acted outside your orders, Admiral St. Julien," said de Trogoff, but without much in the way of anger.
"I acted out of conviction, monsieur, which is more, I think, than you had in mind." That made de Trogoff slap his desk hard with one hand, but it seemed to stem from petulance rather than fury.
"You will address me properly, Admiral. I am your superior officer. You presume to issue a declaration accusing me of treachery, a call to support the revolution as it is interpreted by those who have taken over the government of France. That followed by an instruction to sailors of the fleet to stay ashore, leaving their ships when we have an enemy ready to carry out an assault.
Are you not planning treason?
You, Admiral Saint-Julien, are engaged in it. If you're not, why gather so many sailors into a mob?
There is a need to protect the revolution.
It is you and your Jacobins who threatened the revolution.
I refute that. Saint-Julien looked around the room with a sneer. And I ask myself, why are we discussing this in the company of such people, and allowing a mob to gather outside, some of whom are openly calling for the return of a king? If I was in command—
Which you are not.
If I was in command, the National Guard would be dispersing them at the point of their bayonets.
Capitaine d'Ambert, asked the Trogoff, how many sailors have gathered in the Place d'Armes?
I would estimate the number at some 5,000, sir. But there is also a leavening of civilians and National Guardsmen amongst them. Not many, but some.
Saint-Julien cut in. There are honest men in Toulon, then?
The Trogoff ignored him, and with a worried look asked,
Are they a danger?
They are leaderless, sir, and at the moment mainly without weapons. Without Admiral Saint-Julien, they have no idea what to do. I am happy to say that no officers obeyed the Admiral's order to abandon their duties and join with the mob.
And the sous-officers?
They, sir, have stayed at their posts aboard ship and done their best to persuade the crews to stay neutral. Also, I have set some trusted men to man the guns on one of the repairing warships in the inner harbour. Those guns are trained on the entrance to the arsenal.
There you are, Saint-Julien, the Trogoff said. All that hot air to no purpose. The question is, what are we to do now? And most importantly, what are we to do with you?
I would suggest a secure confinement, sir, insisted d'Ambert. We cannot let the mob have their way.
How noble, d'Ambert, Saint-Julien sneered. I hope you have enough men to get me to a place of safety.
It was the captain's turn to be sharp, and there was no petulance in his reply. I am extending to you, Admiral, a courtesy I doubt you would extend to me, but then I was brought up to believe that no man should be killed for his beliefs.
You should be prepared to die for your honour, and one day you shall, but it will be for your perfidy.
Pearce finally spoke up. Admiral Hood should be told what is happening. That made the Trogoff shift uncomfortably in his chair.
Are we absolutely sure what is happening? I am not certain you understand the currents of politics in this part of the world, Lieutenant.
I understand them very well, Pearce insisted. They differ little from those of Paris in that he who acts boldly usually carries the day, and there is support for you if you do so. That shouting outside the window is not in my imagination. The town has made its voice and its aspirations known.
There are a dozen different opinions out there.
All anti-Jacobin, Admiral. The only question left is for you to make known where you stand. If he had hoped for a response, Pearce was disappointed. The Trogoff just sat in his chair, half-slumped, clearly overloaded with his responsibilities, while outside in the harbour thousands of people waited for a decision which only he could make. It was a full minute before he spoke.
5,000 in the Place d'Armes, you say, d'Ambert?
The nod had the Admiral's chin on his chest.
We cannot imprison that number, nor can we have them free to do what they will.
Then, sir, d'Ambert replied, we must send them away from here, get them out of Toulon. The response was not a question.
Send them away, yes.
Then the Trogoff looked up, a gleam in his eye.
But will they go?
No one had the answer, but the Trogoff did.
They will go if you, Saint-Julien, will lead them.
Sir! d'Ambert protested, only to be silenced by a hand as the Trogoff addressed his second-in-command.
I have no mind to lock up an admiral of the French Navy. It is not fitting. Nor am I prepared to hand you over to another authority and risk seeing you strung up like a common criminal. I suggest it might set a precedent.
The threat was obvious. Hang me, and one day the same could happen to you. That the threat struck home was obvious, and Trogoff blanched at the thought of swinging himself. If he had doubted his course of action before, that evaporated, and his manner seemed more positive.
Admiral Saint-Julien, if you give me your parole that you will lead these malcontents away from Toulon and keep them from any wrongdoing on the way, I will accept your word and let you go.
As if on cue, the noise outside rose, and the threats to hang the Jacobin were the loudest. Even under his darker skin, and for all his bravado, it was clear that the junior admiral was fearful. His eyes were drawn to the window as he spoke.
I accept. You must depart at once and leave your servants behind. I will send them on to you with all your possessions.
Then de Trogoff, knowing the man's proclivities well, added,
And of course anyone you wish to keep under your protection.
Saint-Julien grabbed a quill and a piece of paper off the desk and scribbled down a couple of names, which he handed to de Trogoff, who said,
I hope, Admiral, that we meet again in happier times. The rear of these headquarters is guarded by Marines, and clear of those clamouring for your head.
It was obvious that they had not originally been put there for his benefit, so Saint-Julien just snorted and without another word left the room, leaving the man who had troubled to ensure a route for his own escape to crow.
A neat solution, don't you think, gentlemen?
It was D'Ambert who replied, A solution, sir. Only time will attest to how neat it is. Now, when will you go to meet Lord Hood?
I will not meet Lord Hood, D'Ambert.
You must, sir. The little rotund admiral was all unction as he replied,
There is no must about it, D'Ambert. I am resigning my command as of this moment. I will not have those Jacobin swine in Paris say I am a traitor. Besides, it is up to the town delegates to do what is necessary. Let them be sullied by that.
And our ships?
If you wish to surrender a fleet of France to an Englishman, then you do it.
You will receive Lord Hood if he comes ashore, will you not?
I have had my servants packing all morning, Captain. If the townspeople invite the English to come ashore and protect them from the forces of the Revolution, I will be in my carriage on my way to Italy. Once there, I will decide if it is wise to carry on to the Rhine, to the encampment of the Comte d'Artois.
And if we succeed in detaching Provence, the loss of Marseille might not be permanent.
Succeed in detaching France, D'Ambert. Nothing less will do.
Looking out from his tower, still fuming at his treatment by Pearce, Ralph Barclay, bandage removed to show an ugly scab, was watching things unfold with increasing confusion. He had observed numerous crowds of jeering sailors making their way into the town, to be greeted by gestures from the inhabitants that were far from friendly. If there had been mayhem before, it was clearly getting worse. Was what he and D'Ambert talked about actually coming to pass? He could also see the back of the mob outside de Trogoff's headquarters, but he could not make out what it was they were baying for. Perhaps the Admiral's head. He knew from his own experience that such gatherings were fickle. No lover of the mob, he was far from convinced that what was afoot boded well, and so he had ordered a boat to take him over to the infirmary, which had the virtue of being further away from whatever trouble was brewing. If things turned out well, such a move would cause no harm. If it was threatening, then, as he explained to his wife, the infirmary, furthest from the centre of things, was the best place to be. "Should we not then inform those in the guard-room?" asked Emily, talking to his back as she donned a cloak to keep off the sea spray.
"Plaister?" he asked.
"Who else?"
"Will the guards let them come with us, my dear?"
That was when Barclay turned and saw the look on her face, and as quick as a flash, for it was not a pleasant one, he said, "They will be obliged to stay, and I have had the thought that so must I. It would never do to desert my officers." "And me?" "My dear, it was your safety that first raised my concern, and I have to admit, though you will find this hard to credit, that in thinking of you I had momentarily forgotten about those in the guardroom, which is something of which I am now ashamed. You must take the boat, alert Mr. Lutchins that something is afoot, and tell him to take what precautions he can in case it turns threatening."
"I would rather stay with you."
"Madam," Ralph Barclay said in a kindly tone, "that is an order, and as my wife I expect you to obey it." With that he stepped forward and kissed her on the forehead. "Now put on your bonnet and go." Back on the rampart, having seen Emily's boat pull clear, once more watching the mayhem across the P.3, the knock made him stiffen, but the door opened to reveal Glaister and Bourne looking perplexed. "Our guards, sir. They unlocked the door to our room and then left their posts. What should we do?" Ralph Barclay went out to the gateway, looked along the neck of land that ran towards Toulon, and saw that his crew were no longer working, but sitting idly, with no sign of anyone driving them to do otherwise. That added to his confusion, but on one thing he was determined. Whatever was taking place, it was no job of his to get involved, and since they were in no danger, it would be best to let them stay where they were, as any movement of such a body of men back to the tower might alert forces with which he would rather not have to deal. "We stay put, gentlemen, but you may fetch your fellow prisoners up to these ramparts, so that they can at least see what is happening." A request to Lord Hood had been drafted, the leaders of the town, like Mancini, ensuring it came from the delegates to the local convention, not the navy. Pearce went out with them to stand at the back and watch the formalities take place, a formal request for protection. Then Hood presented his terms, that a British governor would need to take charge of all civil affairs, and that official must have all the powers he would need under martial law, though he would operate through local functionaries in any decrees he implemented. That all French ships in the harbour must immediately strike their flags and be for use by the British Navy as they saw fit, an instruction Pearce was ordered to take back to Captain d'Ambert, now the senior French officer in the port. This he did, expecting the man to object, but d'Ambert did nothing of the kind. He merely invited Pearce to step outside, where he led him to the flagstaff that had served to relay orders to the fleet. There he hauled down the tricolour flag of the Revolution and fastened on the fleur-de-lis of the Royal House of France. As he raised it, a signal gun fired from just along the quay, and on every ship in the harbour the tricolour was struck and the same flag flew to the masthead. "You see, Lieutenant Pearce, we have declared for the king. We are now part of the coalition against the madmen of Paris. Lord Hood must now treat us as allies. Far better that than surrender." "Well, Mr. Sykes, I find you at rest, I see." Sykes, sitting on a bollard, looked up at Pearce, and examining his face, saw the swellings where Saint-Julien had hit him. "You been in the wars?" Pearce nodded, but made no mention of his arm, which was hurting like the devil. "I still don't know what to call you." "For the moment, John Pearce will do." "So what's happening, John Pearce?" "If you would care to come with me, I would like to take you aboard a ship." "Which ship?" Sykes asked, with the suspicious look of someone being told something too good to be true. "Brilliant." "The Frogs have surrendered?" "No, it seems they have decided to join us. It's not the same." Looking towards the Tour de Mitre, he saw Barclay hurrying towards them, a knot of other men, including 2 officers, behind him, though he was unaware that it was once more a sight of his coat that had made the man depart his refuge. "Brilliant will be ours again, and I would like you aboard before the captain." Sykes followed his gaze and shook his head. "Sorry, Pearce, but I reckon from now on you don't have to live with the bastard. We do." "As you wish." "One thing," Sykes said as he stood up. "We've got a few in the infirmary, which is on the other side of the bay. It would be kind of you to let them know what has happened." "I will do that, happily." "You best move before you has to carry out what you said and kill Barclay. Might be a trifle hard with him surrounded by his officers." "Barclay can wait, Mr. Sykes. Not for long, but he can wait." Chapter 20. "Hello, Martin." Young Dent swung round so quickly he was wincing from the pain in his back by the time he faced John Pearce. "I'm looking for Mr. Lutyens. Can you tell me where I can find him?" Martin eased his bandaged shoulder, then indicated the open French windows. "He's out on the terrace. But what is you doing got up in that cab? Never mind that, what in Christ's name are you doing here?" The throbbing pain in Pearce's arm had grown worse, and much as he knew he would have to explain himself, that was more pressing. Half turning, he showed the singed hole where Saint-Julien had stabbed him with the nail. "Later, I need the surgeon to look at my arm." Martin grinned and tapped his cheek. "You been fighting?" "I'm afraid so." "Don't know why," Martin said, grinning as he tweaked the nose that Pearce had broken. "You's a right bugger for a scrap, I seem to recall." Pearce smiled, nodded, and went out to the terrace, with Martin shouting after him. "I'm happy to see you, matey. Never mind how you got here." The shout caused the two people sitting on the rough bench to react. Lutyens, who was facing his way, twisted enough to catch sight of him. Emily Barclay had to spin round completely, which had him removing his hat and bowing in a gesture of habitual politeness. The surgeon looked confused, the same as all the others he had met in Toulon, except on his singular countenance the effect was more marked. Emily Barclay reacted with shock, which was still on her face when he had completed his bow, and she stared at him in silence, her eyes ranging over his face, the even features, the direct, faintly amused and daring look remembered from the first time she had clapped eyes on him, which his bruised swellings did nothing to alter. When he spoke, even his voice was familiar. "Mrs. Barclay, my compliments. Mr. Lutyens, I'm happy to see you again." She blushed, the reddening of her cheeks adding to her attractiveness. It was the surgeon who spoke, pale blue eyes like saucers, his wispy near-ginger hair lifted by the breeze to stand up from his head. "Pearce?" "The very same, Mr. Lutyens, like the proverbial bad penny." "Your dress?" Pearce spoke for Emily Barclay, not Lutyens. His voice pitched just the serious side of absurdity. "It is entirely genuine, though there are those who question if it is deserved. A most fortuitous set of circumstances have given me a lieutenant's rank." "I cannot wait to hear you tell your tale." "That must wait, sir, since I require your services to treat a wound." Lutyens was off the bench in a flash, coming between him and Emily Barclay. She stood and said in a slightly flustered voice, grateful for an excuse to get away, "I will leave you to your duties, Mr. Lutyens, and visit the wounded." Lutyens touched the wound, causing pain, which reminded Pearce that he was a cack-handed individual in that respect. Not incompetent, just disinterested in the discomfort of others. "A red-hot nail jammed in. I fear it went quite deep." He spoke again before the surgeon could. "Don't ask how." "Take off your coat and let me see." That had to be eased off, as the pain was now quite acute, and, unable to get a good look, the stock and shirt followed. Emily Barclay, passing a window, looked out to see the half-naked Pearce just before he was sat on the bench, so much more like the seaman he had been than the creature in the blue coat. Her mind was racing with the same questions which had bothered everyone else. What was he doing here, ashore in a French port? But there was more. Had it something to do with the turmoil from which her husband had insisted she take shelter? Would Lutyens tell Pearce that she had already visited the wounded on arrival, and thus reveal that her departure had been a cover for a lie and embarrassment? Why should she be embarrassed? While thinking round these notions, her eye drifted to the blue coat which Lutyens had thrown across the back of the bench, and a train of thought surfaced that she would have preferred to suppress. Emily Barclay recalled the high dudgeon with which her husband had returned to their apartment that morning, as well as the observation that had sent him out in the first place, the long-distance sight of a man in the coat of a Royal Navy lieutenant. She could recall quite clearly what he had said on his return, that the wearer had turned out to be an impostor, a blackguard and a traitor he had threatened with chastisement. Lutyens was tending to a man dressed in the same garment, but one salient fact, nor the conclusions it engendered, could not be contained. John Pearce might be all those things her husband had said, but he was certainly a man that Ralph Barclay knew well. If it was he, then why had her husband not said so? "Deveno?"
"Ma'am?"
"The men who rowed me over here, I think they are taking refreshments in the kitchens. Please be so good as to call them for me. I wish to go back." "The only fear of infection," said Lutyens, peering into the angry red hole and the blistering that the nail had caused, "comes from a quantity of your linen being carried into the wound. Was your shirt clean?" "Fresh this morning." Lutyens shouted, "Deveno, fetch the spirits of wine and my medicine case." Seeing the arched eyebrows on his patient at the use of the name, Lutyens added, with a slight cackle, "The captain insisted I use him as an assistant, some kind of reward for his services in the battle. If they fail to arrive, we can assume he has drunk the spirits at least." The bottle was fetched, an amazed look was added, then the bully disappeared as Lutyens rubbed alcohol over the wound. "I'm afraid I can do little for you. The hole is neat, and the burning nail has cauterized the flesh on entry. A little extract of lead will help you with the bruising, and the blisters I will treat with my German herbal tonic. Do you recall it, that most efficacious brew called Melisingeist? Then we will just have to apply a bandage and check it daily to see if it shows any sign of suppurating." "No amputation?" Meant as a joke, it fell flat with Lutyens. "I've had enough of those to last a lifetime." What followed was a garbled account of what had happened to HMS Brilliant, confused because Lutyens was no master of naval terminology or tactics, and also because he had been below in the cockpit throughout. But he did manage to convey how bloody it had been. "Death or glory seems to be habitual in the King's Navy. Are bad pennies? Even more so from what I have observed. Was the letter I wrote of any use?" "Immense," Pearce replied, unsure if it was true or false, but the question reminded him of the help the surgeon had offered aboard Brilliant, quite unbidden, for which he was grateful. It also brought back the image of Lutyens' father in his black coat and priestly collar, an older and more serious physical specimen of the son. "Your father could not have been kinder." "What did he say of me?" His patient winced as Lutyens applied the bandage, seemingly able to jab the wound with every turn. "Oh, no doubt what he has said to you many times, that you are wasting your talents on your chosen path." Pearce had been surprised at what Lutyens had given up to go to sea. Not a promising career, but an established one as a leading medical practitioner in the capital, who, through his connections, had a list of patients that would have been the envy of most of his contemporaries, with fees to match. To abandon that for the lowly life of a naval surgeon was bizarre indeed. "He told you of my previous work?" Pearce nodded, and with a worried look Lutyens asked, "I wonder if you would oblige me by keeping that to yourself? You will, won't you?" "I owe you that and more." Seeing Lutyens embarrassed, he changed the subject. "I was interested to see the captain's wife here, and I must say looking as bonny as ever. Her husband felt that the town was getting dangerous." "It will be safe now, Mr. Lutyens. In fact, I expect before tomorrow is over that you will find the British fleet anchored just out there in the outer roads, and you may choose to stay here or go back aboard Brilliant." "So the men will be freed?" "Naturally," Pearce replied, wondering why Lutyens looked disappointed. "And you?" "I have to go aboard another vessel called HMS Leander to visit some old friends of mine." Lutyens tapped the coat, which now lay across the bench. "Not till you have told me how this came to pass." The arrival of the British fleet occasioned a massive discharge of guns as every fort and bastion felt it had to salute Hood's flag, and every ship in the fleet saw the need to reply. Stood on HMS Victory's quarterdeck, surrounded by flag officers, Pearce kept a telescope trained on Leander, coasting in under topsails in the middle of Admiral Hotham's division. Bourbon flag flying, the French had moved from their blocking position across the entrance to the P.3, but either because of caution or good manners, Hood made no attempt to enter the inner anchorage, happy to keep his ships in the outer roads. But a stream of boats did make their way to the shore, full of the fleet marines and those who would command them. This while yet more came out from the port carrying dignitaries and French naval officers who would conclude the terms of the agreement. Mancini and his fellow delegates were piped aboard, as was D'Ambert, who threw him a warm look, all there to discuss how Toulon was to avoid the fate of Marseille. With so many boats employed shipping troops ashore, Pearce had to wait to ask for one to transport him to Leander, so he was still aboard when Ralph Barclay arrived to see the Admiral. After a glaring exchange, Knight took his fellow captain to his own cabin, later sending for midshipmen Fermelo and Burns, for what Pearce supposed was probably a happy reunion. Finally, with a meeting in Hood's great cabin in full swing and an injunction preventing any officer not on a particular service to stay out of both town and port, a boat became available, and he was rowed across to the now anchored 74, where he went through the ritual of asking for permission to come aboard, readily granted by a fellow lieutenant called Tabley, the officer of the watch. "I am seeking some men with whom I served before." "The wardroom is at your disposal, Mr. Pearce." "Not officers, seamen. Those who were taken aboard at Spithead from HMS Centurion. They were from the armed cutter Griffin." "Seamen?" said Tabley with an arch look. "How singular that you call them friends." Pearce was quite cold when he answered, "I find that when you face death with people, their rank ceases to have much relevance. If I were to give you their names—" "I have my own duties to perform, Mr. Pearce. Besides, you will have to seek permission from the Premier, who is at present in his cabin. I presume you can find your way there." Pearce decided he did not like Tabley, and it was plain from the look on that fellow's face that the feeling was mutual. So he nodded and made his way aft, then down to the deck below. But instead of making for the wardroom, he just carried on to the lower deck, to the crowded quarters which were home to the crew and the ship's main armament. The sight of an officer made quite a few men stiffen. The presence of a blue coat in this part of the ship, outside a battle, was to order some unpleasant task carried out, to ensure none of the articles of war were being breached, or just to nose around looking for something not right. In other words, to cause trouble. Bent over and hat off, for the deck beams were close to his head, Pearce made his way down the central walkway. The mess tables were down, one between each cannon, with its 6-man section taking their ease, happy to be at anchor, with little to do, talking, no doubt speculating on when they would get ashore and what they would find there in the article of women and drink. Some were dicing, but not for any money he would be allowed to see. Others carving or mending clothing, the rest just idling with 1 or 2 sleeping heads on their tables. It was Charlie Taverner's hat he saw first, that item of clothing so dear to him, always tipped back to show his fair hair, which he felt marked him as how he wanted to be seen, not a sailor, but a bit of a gent. There was Michael O'Hagan's back, broad enough to blot out 2 others in the mess. Fat Blubber, spotting the uniform coat, made sure his mates were aware of the approaching danger, which killed off their conversation and had them all looking at the tabletop. It took no flash of insight to guess at that point this was not a happy ship. The men had been like that aboard Brilliant, chary about catching the eye of authority. After the postal packet and his time on HMS Tartar with the sarcastic Captain Fremantle, he had seen how a happy ship was run, knew on such a vessel the crew were pleased to smile at an officer, and expected the same in return. No eye met his as he stopped by their table. As well as those already identified, he recognized old Latimer, Rufus Dommett stuck in the corner, and the merchant sailor Littlejohn, who had been pressed with them into Griffin. Pearce put his hat on the table and spoke quietly. "Well, here's a sorry bunch of tars, I must say, not willing to offer a seat to an old shipmate." Rufus Dommett could not keep his head down, he being a person who combined youth and endemic folly. But neither could he speak, his mouth working silently and his finger jabbing towards the visitor. "Somebody pinch me," said Latimer, the next to look up, his dark, weather-beaten face even more wrinkled than usual by disbelief. "John, boy." Pearce held out his hand, looking into the bright green eyes of O'Hagan, and to the fact that the brows on his square face seemed to be swollen, and that he too was bruised. "Michael, it's very good to see you. Indeed, it is very good to see you all." "You took your time getting here," said Charlie Taverner, but there was joy in it, not malice. "Pull up a barrel and park yourself."
"Now, my old eyes might be playing tricks, Pearce," said Latimer, "but that ain't no midcoat you's a-wearing."
"It's not, old friend, but it is mine by right, gifted to me by Farmer George himself." "You're on a ship?" asked Michael, so far more reserved than the others. "I am not. I am here to get you free, and I can tell you that it has been a damned hard job to make the journey." The rest of the crew, 400 men barring those on deck, were made curious by the sight of an officer sitting jawing with common seamen, all 7 at the table hugger-mugger, gasping and occasionally laughing as he told them a tale. Enough of them braved the possibility of censure to move closer, and as each part of Pearce's story was told, the salient point was passed around the deck. But there was one person who hung back from this, and eventually decided to go aloft and tell someone in authority of this strange apparition, which led to the arrival of a midshipman with a request that Mr. Pearce attend immediately upon the officer of the watch. Looking past him, standing, though well back, Pearce saw Cornelius Gerson. "I see Corny has not lost his gift for duplicity." "He never will," said Charlie, glaring at the man. "Sir," insisted the midshipman, "if you cannot command the men to silence, I must." "What happened in Portsmouth, John boy?" asked Michael, ignoring how much the midshipman was angered by his temerity in continuing to converse. "Why did you not come back as you said you would?" "A woman, Michael." There was a pause, with Pearce waiting for the bitter condemnation that was bound to follow, but the huge Irishman just put back his head and laughed, spluttering. "A woman! Holy Mother of Christ, how often have I fallen by the wayside for that sin? A woman, by God, sure, I hope she was a decent filly." He could see that the others wanted to speak, some to follow Michael and laugh, Charlie with the peaked look of a man who could not decide if he was angry or jealous, but the presence of the midshipman, plainly seething, ensured silence. "I will get you free, lads, I promise." The midshipman actually growled, "Mr. Tabley is waiting, sir." The name brought a strange look to Michael's face. The laughter evaporated as quickly as it had emerged, and whatever thoughts he had were mirrored in the glum faces of the others. "That might not be as easy as you think, John boy." Pearce half stood, picking up his hat. "Yes, it will. I have Lord Hood on my side as well as the law."
"I demand to know what you, sir, were doing on the lower deck of my ship, sitting on a barrel talking to those men like some fishwife, without permission to do so."
"I told you, Mr. Tabley. They are friends of mine. What's more, 3 of them were illegally pressed, and it is my intention to get them ashore and free."
"Illegally pressed?"
Tabley demanded, as though the notion itself was nonsense. "O'Hagan, Taverner, and Domitor, their names. I will not trouble you with the actual circumstance, but I can assure you of the absolute truth of what I say."
"You can assure away, sir, but I can likewise assure you that those men will serve in this ship probably until the peace."
"Forgive me, sir, but you are not the captain, who is the man who will make the decision."
"I can speak for him, Mr. Pearce, and a great number of the crew, especially as we are here in Toulon and the fleet is at anchor. Seek to remove O'Hagan and there will be a riot."
"A riot?" asked Pearce, totally thrown.
"Every man aboard Leander expects to make a bit out of his prowess. As soon as possible we will challenge every ship in the fleet to put up a bruiser, maybe even one from the French. I hazard that few will match O'Hagan, which will line the pocket of every man who backs him, and his shipmates will."
"Like in Gibraltar?"
"Exactly," Tabley replied, his face eager. "That made us a pretty penny, I can tell you."
"It did nothing for Michael O'Hagan. I have seen how his face has altered."
"Rubbish! He had light duties for a week, he gets special food, though annoyingly he shares that with his mess, as well as a cash reward for his efforts."
"It does not occur to you that he might prefer not to fight?"
"Prefer not?" demanded Tabley in a shocked tone. "What the devil, sir, are you talking about?
Seamen do not state their preferences. They do as they are bid and hope to do it well enough to avoid being punished. Or are you one of these tender-hearted fools who indulge as common tars? They need the lashman to do their duty, if not on their backs, in their minds."
"I would like to see the captain." Taberley sneered at him.
"I very much doubt if the captain would care to see you."
"He can see me now, or when I come aboard with an order from Lord Hood to release the named men. I would prefer it, and I am sure he would too, to offer them up without instructions." Taberley took a step back and put his hands on his hips, examining Pearce as though he was some freak-show exhibit.
"You really are the most extraordinary fellow, Pearce. I've never heard of you, and I doubt anyone has. You have a commission a few weeks old, and yet you come aboard my ship looking as if you've been brawling in the gutter, bandy about the name of the Commander-in-Chief as though his sole purpose is to do your bidding, and even threaten the captain with discomfort. I think you have taken leave of your senses."
Pearce wanted to slap him, but instead he smiled. "It is you who are the fool, sir. You who will face the wrath of your captain when I explain to him, as I most certainly will get an opportunity to do, that you failed to see the seriousness of my request."
"What I fail to see, sir, is what you are doing on this deck, which I would be obliged if you would leave."
"I will be back."
"Then you'd best come with orders, sir, for I will ensure that every officer on Leander knows of you, and that any attempt to return to this deck without official sanction will be declined."
Pearce turned to go, but spun round for a parting shot. "You best tell the ship, sir, that if they want a boxing bout, they best find another champion. O'Hagan will not fight, for I will tell him to refuse." Taberley had no idea how close he came himself to being floored when he replied with a humourless grin.
"Refuse? Men in my division do not refuse. I do not think O'Hagan will dare, especially when the option is to fight or take a turn at the grating."
Still seething, John Pearce returned to HMS Victory, to find the whole Toulon delegation still there, including a worried-looking Baron d'Ambert, his concerns, once voiced, weighing heavily.
"I persuaded Admiral de Trogoff to stay on the grounds of his own personal safety and treat with Lord Hood, but it will not surprise you to know that Saint-Julien, in order to save his own skin, left without bothering to take with him his Republican followers. So we have near 5,000 of them, officers and men, sitting in the town, and the Lord alone knows what to do with them."
"Did you not say there were no officers in the crowd at the Place d'Armes?"
"I lied, Lieutenant Pearce, for fear of the effect it would have on my admiral. Now I fear for the effect it will have on yours."
A voice summoned him to the great cabin, and d'Ambert gave Pearce a weak smile as he moved away.
"I must go in there and propose a solution."
Chapter 21. Ralph Barclay had to wait a long time to see Lord Hood, which underlined to him his place in the pecking order. This driven home to him when Captain Knight played host to several captains who had been admitted, and had poured many glasses of wine, amongst them the captain of HMS Agamemnon. He was a man for whom Barclay had an almost visceral dislike, Horatio Nelson being the antithesis of what he considered to be a competent officer. Added to that were two facts that rankled even more. Though just ahead of him on the captain's list, Nelson had been given command of a 64-gun ship, while he had a small frigate. The other was more telling. Nelson was known to be esteemed by Lord Hood, which Ralph Barclay most assuredly was not. Then there was the other point which mystified him. Nelson thought of him as a friend and treated him as such. But then the man was like that. Quite a number of his fellow captains found him to be a bit of a sycophant. "I have orders for Naples," piped Nelson in that voice which Ralph Barclay described to others, including his wife, as girlish. "They're being drawn up as we speak. I must impress upon the court of the Two Sicilies that a failure to support the Toulon enterprise will do them harm in the long run." Naples? Him? Ralph Barclay thought, looking down at Nelson. Hood must be mad. Surely he should send someone of stature, not to mention height, instead of this pint-sized poltroon. "How interesting, Captain Nelson.
you will be able to exercise your diplomatic skills."
Nelson laughed, or as Berkeley would later describe it, giggled, totally missing the sarcastic tone.
"I am damned short on those, I can assure you. But I am informed that the representative at Naples is a competent fellow." "Hamilton." "You know him?" "I know of him, who does not? He tied himself to that trollop who sat for Romney, the one with the auburn hair, Emma something or other. Only God knows how many men she lay on her back for before she snared the old fool. Imagine a relative of the Duke of Hamilton, a childhood friend of the King, in his 60s, and he goes and marries a whore."
A servant topped up Berkeley's glass, but Nelson declined.
"I was not aware of this, I must say." "I am surprised, sir. Where have you been?"
"Norfolk," Nelson replied in a hurt tone.
5 years of unemployment, which I know is an experience we share."
Ralph Berkeley actually growled, though not at Nelson. Those 5 years on half pay, lying to tradesmen, fobbing off his creditors, denying things to his sisters they saw as essential, were not something of which he cared to be reminded. At least they had ended happily with marriage and a ship.
"Well, let's hope that old Sir William has not lost his marbles completely."
Ralph Berkeley waited for the response to his jest, but none came, which led him to conclude that amongst the other things Nelson did not know was that Sir William Hamilton was a noted collector of Roman antiquities.
"I am sure you will enjoy a visit to Naples, Nelson. I've heard the ladies are very willing in that neck of the woods. Captain Augustus Harvey apparently sired several bastards in those parts in the late 50s.
"I shan't linger,"
Nelson replied seriously, equally quick to miss the salacious look which had taken hold of the face of his companion.
"Once my mission is accomplished, I shall be straight back here. Why would I not, when there is going to be some fighting?"
"Captain Berkeley."
Turning, he saw the C&C's letter-writer.
"Lord Hood will see you now." "Good luck in Naples, Nelson. Don't get up to any mischief. Remember, every man is a bachelor east of Gibraltar."
Nelson blushed at that, and added a slightly forced smile, it being something he had said, too loud and drunk with it, at a dinner in Lisbon.
"Captain Berkeley," demanded Lord Hood in a voice that lacked any welcome, "what is it you wish to see me about on a day when I have hardly a second to spare?" "I wish to give you my report on the action of HMS Brilliant."
Ralph Berkeley took a chance to nod to the others in the cabin, Admirals Hotham, Parker, and Rear Admiral Goodall.
"Surely you mean the loss," said Hood. "We have her back now, sir," Berkeley said, placing the dispatch on the table, "and most of her repairs are completed. I have taken the liberty of raiding the French storehouses, so I can confidently say that she is in all respects bar one ready for service." "Bar one?" "I lost hands in the battle, sir, which leaves me short."
Hood, busy reading the dispatch, just grunted.
"I hear it was a hot action, Berkeley," said Hotham, "and damned difficult odds." "Damned hot, sir, and I so very nearly got clear, but the wind was dead foul."
It was Parker's turn to speak.
"I have to say, Captain, that questions have been raised about the probity of this encounter."
The response had been rehearsed 100 times in the last few days of captivity, so came out smoothly.
"Sir, I saw it as my duty to ensure that the French did not weigh, to sow in their minds the notion that this very fleet was close enough to bring them to an action should they do so. When you read my report, you will see that I had the necessary signals flying to convey that message." "A bluff, Berkeley," said Hotham in a rather forced manner. "Precisely that, sir. I feared that if they got out on a wind, they could head in any direction." "And if they had?" demanded Parker. "It was my intention to shadow them, sir, then communicate the course to the cutter I left on station." "Very proper," said Hotham, throwing a glance at Hood, who was still digesting the report on the action. The possibility of censure existed. It always did in King George's navy, regardless of what one did, but he looked to Hotham for support. Hood, he knew, had little time for him. They had clashed in London before Brilliant weighed,
and it had been obvious that he still saw him in the light of his past connections. Berkeley had been a protege of the late Admiral Sir George Bridges Rodney, a man he considered a genius, while Hood reviled his one-time superior as a fount of misplaced greed and outright corruption. The problem for Ralph Berkeley was in the late. Admiral Rodney was dead, and nothing so blighted an officer's career as being attached to a senior who was a corpse, for he could do nothing to advance his followers from the grave, and that was the source of elevation. Without interest in the world, a man was nothing, regardless of which profession he chose to follow, and in the Navy it was especially paramount. He and Hotham, though it had not been stated openly, had come to an understanding in Lisbon. He had done the Admiral a favour, without asking for anything in return, as a sign of his attachment. So for Ralph Berkeley, Hotham, hopefully, had replaced the late lamented Rodney.
"Hans, Berkeley," said Hood finally. "I seem to recall having a discussion on that topic before."
"Yes, sir, at the Admiralty."
"Ah, yes. You implied I was a liar."
"I doubt that, sir," Hotham insisted, shock on his carefully barbered face.
"Captain Berkeley is not that sort of officer."
Hood looked from one to the other and smiled to himself as he dropped his eyes back to the papers in front of him, the letters from William Pitt, the main thrust of which was the tenuous nature of his government's power. No one knew better than Samuel Hood the skeins of interest and how they operated, and by speaking as he had, Hotham had just told him that he was prepared to act as Berkeley's protector. That complicated matters, for in the private correspondence that had come with Pearce, it had been made plain that his second-in-command had powerful friends in Parliament, like the Whig Duke of Portland, who led a faction inclined to support the war against France. These were people that Pitt was trying to seduce into joining his government, and the addition of such support was no light matter, for that block of votes, in effect splitting and emasculating the Whig opposition, would make his position as the King's First Minister unassailable. Concomitant to that, although not stated in writing, was the obvious fact that Sir William Hotham, because of that connection, was a man to be handled with care. To upset him, to have him writing home to his friends in complaint, which might give them cause to rebuff Pitt, was to risk the future of the government he supported, as well as his own position as C&C in the Mediterranean.
"But the discussion was about Hans, was it not?"
Hood insisted. "I was very short on my compliments, sir," Ralph Berkeley replied.
"So short that you indulged in a little illegal impressment?"
"Sir?"
"We had an officer come out from England, a Lieutenant Pearce."
"Surely he is not truly of that rank, sir?"
"Please do not interrupt me, Captain."
Berkeley nodded an apology, his mind spinning as to where this conversation was leading.
"As I said, Pearce. He is a lieutenant, made so at the insistence of the King himself."
This was a time for Ralph Berkeley to stay silent. To express his thoughts to a room full of admirals that the King must indeed be mad was professional suicide.
"And for outstanding bravery, Captain Berkeley. Now this man says you pressed him and others illegally."
"There is no truth in that, sir."
"So Pearce is a liar?"
"I did press men before we weighed, but I took them to be seamen. If this Pearce, whom I can scarcely recall, says he is not of that profession, then all I can say is that it did not appear to be the case to those I sent out hunting."
"You did not go yourself?"
"No." The negative response was out before he thought it through, and he suspected it to be a mistake. But withdrawal was impossible. Hood smiled to himself again.
"Perhaps we should bring you face to face with the fellow, and see who is telling the truth."
"With respect, sir," said Hotham, "this is hardly a subject for a fleet with the defence of Toulon to deal with." Hood looked at Hotham with something less than affability. They did not get on, but his mind was registering the fact that his second-in-command would not only protect Berkeley, but might go to some lengths to do so, just to establish his own position. If he could receive private correspondence, so could Hotham, It made him wonder at what bargain they had struck. But since he would never know, he gave up speculating. All he knew was that politics would insist that he accede to whatever Hotham demanded, if the man was prepared to push Berkeley's case. He was not about to jeopardize the government of which he was a part for a brand-new lieutenant, who was also the son of a man who abhorred everything that he held sacred. He passed Berkeley's dispatch to his junior, feeling a bit like Pontius Pilate.
"Then we must think of another way to resolve it, Admiral Hotham. I would welcome any suggestions you have."
"These orders are, I assume, from Admiral Hood?" The secretary shrugged in a way that angered John Pearce. "I wish to question them." That got a lazily raised eyebrow. "Question them?" "I had the impression that we both spoke English. What is it about that which I just said you find confusing?" The tone of mockery was unwelcome, that was obvious from the response. The secretary was clearly used to respect, hardly surprising given his lofty office. The C.N.C.'s man of business and fleet prize agent. A hand was held out into which Pearce placed the folded paper to be opened and read. "These orders come from Admiral Hotham." "Hotham?" "Allow that I can recognize the hand of his letter-writer as well as the Admiral's signature." "Why would Admiral Hotham be giving orders to me?" "I have no idea. All I do know is that you have been given a commission, and I have rarely known that to bring anything to a fellow of your rank other than joy." "I don't want a commission." The secretary sat back, exhaling air in the manner of a person who had too much to do and no time to be bothered with this intrusion. "You have the right to refuse, of course, but if you wish to do so, the place to make that known is aboard HMS Britannia, not here." "I wish to see Lord Hood." "Lord Hood is busy." "Ask him." He could not help but feel he was then witness to a performance. An under-secretary was summoned, the same fellow who had lent Pearce his coat, who went into the main cabin only to emerge after a few seconds to whisper in his superior's ear. "Admiral Lord Hood is busy seeing to the defence of Toulon. He has no time to see you, Lieutenant Pearce." "If I wait?" The secretary enjoyed his riposte, which came with a thin-lipped smile. "If you decide to do so, I should fetch your shaving kit." At least he got to see a naval officer aboard Britannia, not Hotham, but his flag lieutenant, a good-looking fellow eager to explain to a less-than-enamoured caller the thinking of his admiral. "Your complaint against Captain Berkeley requires investigation, but you will readily appreciate that this moment is hardly the time to undertake such a thing. The task given to HMS Weasel is neither hazardous nor likely to be of much duration, and her own lieutenant has, like so many other fleet officers, been ordered ashore, leaving Captain Benton unsupported. Since you had no employment, and none of the skills necessary to likewise work on the defences, the Admiral feels that you would be better employed cruising than kicking your heels aboard ship." Reiterating that he did not want a commission brought forth a concerned look from the man he was addressing, a fellow of his own age with the air of a practised diplomat. Now he looked worried. "Lieutenant Pearce, if I may speak to you man to man, and outside my duties as Admiral Hotham's flag lieutenant?" He paused, waiting for a frowning Pearce to nod. "I am aware of your case against Captain Berkeley, but I am also conscious, as I suspect you are not, that you will require the goodwill of the senior officers on the station to bring it to any sort of conclusion. He is a post-captain, and while it may be true that what he did was questionable—" "Illegal!" "There is not another captain or admiral on this station who has not at some time in his career done the same. While they are honest men, they are also serving sailors, who have found themselves in a like situation. It would not be surprising, therefore, that they would have a natural inclination to support Mr. Berkeley." Pearce was genuinely surprised. "You're saying that I'm wasting my time?" "No, Lieutenant Pearce. I am saying that refusing Admiral Hotham's orders will not endear you to him, and he is one of those to whom you must plead your case." I doubt HMS Weasel will be gone for more than a week, by which time things will have settled here, matters will be in hand, and time can be given to consideration of your complaint. I seem to spend my entire time seeking to please admirals."
"Believe me, Mr. Pearce," the flag lieutenant replied in a deeply serious tone, "that is a far better idea than upsetting them." Sensing that his fellow lieutenant was weakening, he added, "Weasel has orders to sail at dawn. I would suggest to you that it would be a good idea to get aboard and introduce yourself to Captain Benton." "I am concerned for my friends." "Which does you credit, sir. But what possible harm can come to them? The French in Toulon are now our allies. The revolutionary armies are occupied subduing Marseille, and are not expected here for weeks. The worst that can happen to them is that they will be sent ashore to throw up earthworks for the gun emplacements being planned for Montfaron." Pearce was torn. Taberley had expressly forbidden him Leander, so he could spend no time with his fellow pelicans. Hood, he suspected, would not see him, neither would Hotham, so his suit would languish, and he was not a person who enjoyed the prospect of being idle, with nothing to do but gnaw on and be frustrated by that. He imagined, once more, duelling with Berkeley, but reverted to a decision he had already made, his determination to see the man disgraced before that took place. He could, of course, go ashore, given that he had an almost proprietary interest in the place, but would he be welcome, and of any use if he was? The port was likely to be a dull place socially until things settled down, and any idea of looking at the region was out of the question, given the impending arrival of a Jacobin army. As long as Michael, Charlie, and Rufus were safe, a week would make no odds, and this sloop, he now knew, was bound for a cruise round Corsica, an island and a people of which he had heard much from James Boswell, one of his father's old verbal sparring partners. Boswell had described it as a wild, romantic place, full of strange sights and an even more peculiar people. If he did not see it now, he probably never would. He was also tempted by another reason, which related to the conversations he had had with Captain McGann. Was he up to the job of running a ship? The gaps in his knowledge were extensive, but he felt he had made a reasonable fist of his tasks aboard Griffin. Add to that what he had learnt aboard the postal packet, and this would be by way of a test. A strange ship, an unfamiliar crew, and he would be, it seemed, the only officer under the captain. It was a chance to put one in the eye of people like Hood who questioned his right to his rank. Even more appealing was the way it would infuriate Berkeley. Had it been a proper place, he would have declined it, regardless, but it was only a temporary posting till the present incumbent was free to resume his duties. "I will accept, but I have one request." "Which is?" "No boxing bouts." The flag lieutenant had to struggle with that. "Boxing bouts?" "Yes, I want a strict instruction to the captain of HMS Leander that he is in no way to arrange or condone such a thing." The man before him was enough of a diplomat to evade the truth with ease, not lie, for he had no idea of what answer Admiral Hotham would give to such a request. "I will see that it is brought to the Admiral's attention." "You may also wish to bring to the Admiral's attention the fact that such an event took place and included gambling at sea while HMS Leander was off the coast of Spain, which, if I am not mistaken, contravenes the Articles of War and should be the subject of a court-martial." On entering Admiral Hotham's cabin, his flag lieutenant was faced with an inquiring look from the two officers present. "Well?" asked Ralph Berkeley. "He has accepted." "Well done," said Hotham. "That gains us time."
"He had one request, sir. A strange one." The young man explained, first to a raised eyebrow, then to a look of disbelief, until finally Hotham exploded, his face going bright red.
"Damn the fellow! Does he want to bring every captain in the fleet to court-martial?"
His flag lieutenant did not reply, thinking the answer was probably yes. Chapter 22. Pearce knew he had erred within 10 minutes of being aboard, not because of any incompetence on his part, not because HMS Weasel was so small, but by the behaviour of the ship's captain. Benton was slightly drunk, and he looked like a fellow who was no stranger to that state, with reddish, watery eyes and that facial colour that spoke of badly corrupted blood under his skin. Pearce had seen too many of the type in his travels to come to any other conclusion. The taverns and pothouses of Britain were full of Bentons, usually addicted to gin rather than that which the captain was drinking now and sharing with his new officer, which Pearce reckoned must be the cheapest form of blackstrap wine, the kind that left a sour taste on the tongue.
"I'm not pleased they took Digby, Mr. Pearce. I want you to know that. He was just getting used to my ways."
"Digby?
You know him?"
"Only if he served aboard HMS Brilliant."
"He did,"
Benton replied, in a voice that had gravel and little affection in it.
"Barclay got shot of him at Lisbon, and he was not the type to fit in on the flagship. Admiral Hotham likes his officers to be true gentlemen, with the means to support that station. Digby lacked either the means or any interest from a patron, so I got him."
Responding to what was a less than pleased tone, and recalling what Digby had been like aboard Brilliant, kind, if a little confused and uncertain, Pearce replied, "I thought him a competent officer, sir."
"He was far from that when he arrived, Pearce, but he benefited from being with me."
The bleary eyes fixed on his new officer over a gulp of wine.
"I assume you're another no-hoper, new to your commission, sent to try my patience?"
"Very likely," Pearce replied, which had the virtue of both being true and surprising Benton enough to make him shift back in his chair.
"Well, be warned," Benton growled, recovering somewhat. "I expect the highest standard of behaviour on my deck, as well as competence, and if you don't have it now, you damn well best acquire it. We weigh at first light our orders to sail round the island of Corsica, home to a couple of French sloops left there to support the military garrison."
"We will be landing?"
"No, Mr. Pearce, we will not."
Suppressing disappointment, and wondering if he had chucked himself into danger, Pearce asked, "And if we find these vessels, sir?"
"We are to report on their location and inform Lord Hood."
Benton shouted then in a voice that must have been heard beyond the bowsprit,
"Harbin!"
That brought to the tiny cabin a freckle-faced youth, a compact sort of youngster who, once outside the cabin, produced a winning smile and a proper welcome aboard. He was instructed to take Pearce round the ship, as though such a thing would take more than 2 minutes. Pearce met the purser, gunner, carpenter, and boatswain, but most importantly, remembering McGann's injunction, the ship's master, a grey-haired fellow of round and ruddy country complexion called Neame, who seemed old to hold a warrant for such a small vessel. He was introduced to 2 other mids and the master's mates. In doing so, he was eyed but not named to the crew, all of whom looked at him with something approaching indifference. It was an act, of course. Every man-jack was curious about this new blue coat, for he was a fellow who could make their lives a joy or a misery. His quarters were cramped, a screened-off space in a tiny wardroom, hardly surprising, but they were the best aboard excepting Benton's. Digby's servant had seen to his dunnage, and he immediately changed from his best coat and hat to more workmanlike apparel. He then inspected the ship unaccompanied, not with any great eye for faults, just to show that he was prepared to go aloft to check on the rigging, and to ensure that the 2 decks were tidy enough in the matter of ropes and other impediments, not to be a danger to those using them. He then invited those who shared the wardroom with him, the master and the purser, to partake of some wine, a dozen of Hermitage he had bought from one of the numerous bumboats which had surrounded Victory for this very purpose. Through a thin bulkhead forward they could hear the mids and other warrants talking quietly, probably trying to assess this new arrival. Through a thicker one behind they picked up the snores of the captain.
"A decent drop,"
said Neame, smacking his lips as he downed his first tankard.
"Better than the captain is inclined to serve."
The purser, Mr. Ottershaw, merely nodded, but the satisfaction at that which he was consuming was plain on his face. Said with caution, Pearce reckoned the master was testing him, and he pulled a face to imply agreement. "He treated me to some of his wine, Mr. Neame. I must tell you I am in no hurry to force another invite." Neame leant close, talking softly. "I doubt you'll get one in a hurry, Mr. Pearce. Captain Benton much prefers his own company. excepting that of a bottle."
"Another drop, sir," Pearce responded, smiling into the perspiring faces of two men who had relaxed a trifle. 2 bottles saw the whole story out. Benton was a protégé of Hotham, his uncle a yellow admiral who had served with the man they termed Hotspur Harry when he had been a midshipman.
"Here's a debt being paid, sir," whispered Ottershaw. "I'm told the uncle resents being an admiral without benefit of flag. He feels shunted aside, never to be employed, and quite unable to grasp his own incompetence." Neither said it outright, but enough hints were given that said lack of proficiency was a family trait, that Benton's drinking was because he knew it to be so, that he had scraped through his lieutenant's examination only because Hotham rigged the panel, and he knew that he would make post only by a miracle. Pearce had relaxed enough to state quite openly that they best not look to him for a rise in standards, that his commission was of short duration only to cover for the absence of Mr. Digby. The mention of that name changed their attitude. They thought Digby a decent, useful officer, and so did the crew. "I will strive for the decency, gentlemen. For the rest, I will rely on you, Mr. Neame." He pulled another Hermitage from the wooden box at his feet. "Now, what do you say we share some of this with the mids and the warrants? I find it is the best way to get to know people." By the time the men were roused out to weigh, word had got round that this new Premier was no hard horse. In fact, that he was more like to be a Digby than a Benton, so there were no sour looks to contend with as the capstan bars were shipped and the anchor hove short, nor when the topman went aloft to loose the sails. Pearce issued his orders to Mr. Neame, and gave responsibility to Harbin, whom he had been told was a keen, sometimes a too keen, midshipman. As the sun rose, the gold of its colour reflected the mass of freckles that covered the boy's face, and he responded to the request to alert the captain with a grin that showed a set of teeth that seemed too numerous for his mouth. All went rigid as Benton came on deck, and what the rising sun did to his flaccid complexion was far from flattering. "Ready to weigh, sir." Benton turned and looked toward HMS Britannia. "Have you observed, Mr. Pearce, our number flying from the masthead of Admiral Hotham's flagship?"
"No, sir," Pearce replied truthfully, following his gaze and ignoring the furiously nodding head of Neame. "I have not."
"If you had, Mr. Pearce, you would see that we are ordered to proceed to sea. I only hope it has not been aloft for long. I would hate to be rebuked by Admiral Hotham for your inability to see his signals. Now be so good as to get us moving."
"Mr. Neame?" Topsails were dropped and sheeted home, the rudder creaked as the quartermaster used the forward movement induced by a land breeze to bring Weasel over her anchor, and sweetly it was plucked from the sandy bottom to be fished and catted. "Mr. Harbin."
"Sir?"
"Issue the orders to swab the decks and alert the cook that he needs to get his coppers lit, since with the sun rising and a warm day there will be no need for flogging dry." He turned to look for Benton to see if that would be acceptable, but the captain had gone. He had to deal with Benton, but in his quarters, for it seemed he had a mortal fear of fresh air, or such a love of wine to sip that he feared to be separated from a supply. The man took his breakfast alone, and that extended to his dinner. He did come on deck before that, but only for a short time, to ensure that Pearce was not sailing them in the wrong direction. But after a brief look at the slate and the course, and a glance at the sail plan, he grunted his satisfaction, ordered that the details be sent to him in his cabin, and went back into that place. In contrast, Pearce was relishing the sun and the wind on his face, the azure blue of the sea with dolphins off the bows, and the fact that the contact with his inferiors seemed easy. The gunner particularly was a chatterer, a crook-faced fellow, happy to converse with this new officer about weight of shot, the size of powder charges, elevation and ballistics, in a way that assumed Pearce knew what he was talking about, rubbing with a loving hand one of the 12 9-pounders that were Weasel's armament.
"As you know, sir, a set of long nines like these won't do much at range. Well short on a mile with a 5-degree elevation and a 4-pound charge. But they're enough to put a ball through a foot of scantlings at half of that. Was you, begging your pardon, Mr. Pearce, to get us close,
They would answer well." Recalling his service aboard Brilliant and the insistence of regular exercise, he soon established that it was not something into which Benton put much effort. Even after less than a day, he was tempted to ask what the captain did do, only to deduce from the replies what he knew already to be true, that a captain, provided he properly kept his logs and did not seek too much in the way of bookish deceit with his muster and stores, could do very much what he pleased. "Mr. Digby suggested, Your Honour, with not a thought that it gave us work, to keep them blacked and handsome. Half-hour each day, sir, late afternoon he wanted, but the captain wouldn't have it. Can't do it now, I reckon. With our marines gone ashore, we're short on hands to man the breechings. So if you're thinking that way, it might be best left until we has all the labour we needs." That left Pearce not knowing if the gunner was for exercise or against it, especially as at that moment the fellow leant over and kissed the royal insignia on the top of the cannon he was caressing. The boatswain and carpenter were not as relaxed as the gunner in commissioned company, the latter particularly ill at ease, for the sloop was no spring chicken, and even after a refit at Buckler's Hard the scantlings moved in a heavy sea and apparently wept significant amounts of water.
"It was hard pumping in the channel, Your Honour," he intoned in a miserable voice, "and even worse in Biscay. We've got a right good sea state now, but you mark it. If it comes on heavy, we'll struggle to keep down the water in the well."
Talking to the boatswain about the distribution of the crew, the state of the sails, including the spare suit, ropes, spars, and blocks, Pearce began to appreciate the complexities of running even a ship this size. Not the sailing or navigation, but getting the best out of the men, for McGann had insisted that was where the true merit of command lay. Though he could not himself consider going that way, he could grasp why many a ship's captain saw the lash as the route to discipline, it being so much easier than the effort of gaining personal respect. Thankfully, given the short-term nature of this commission, it was not something to which he had to give much concern. Corsica, on a decent wind, was less than a day's sailing, and before nightfall they had looked deep into the long, sandy bay of San Fiorenzo to the north, with Mr. Neame, on Benton's orders, making a sketch of the main features, especially the fortifications, which consisted of some odd round towers dotted around the coastline. That, and of the ability of the place to provide holding ground for large warships, which saw him out in a boat with a tallow line checking the seabed. "Why the detail, Mr. Neame?" asked Pearce when he came back aboard.
"Don't take a genius to figure that, sir. Happen we get the heave-o from Toulon, we'll need another place to anchor, and victual. Mr. Benton has orders to look out for that. Did he not say so?"
"No, Mr. Neame, he did not." The master grinned.
"Don't let on to me either, Mr. Pearce. I had it from the master of Britannia, who's an old shipmate. Went to see him for a wet after we anchored in the Toulon roads. The Dons won't hear of us using Port Mahon on Minorca, which we had afore, case they can't get shot of us, and we has to have a place to shelter and revictual to keep to the med."
Once more John Pearce was forced to admit that Hood was clever. It was not a betrayal to seek an alternative to Toulon, just wise to have a backstop in case of disaster. Neame's jovial note changed to one of resentment.
"Mind, when we gets back, Captain will take my drawings aboard the flagship, no doubt saying they're his own."
They set a course west to weather the western arm of the bay, a bleak and forbidding promontory of rocks and black beaches, and with the northerly holding true, the next morning saw them off the much more formidable Calvi, a port below a high citadel and a fortified town on the western promontory of a deep but shallow-watered bay, surrounded by high mountains. One of the sloops for which they had been tasked to look out lay snug and safe under the shore-based guns, though down to bare poles and not ready for sea. Benton was on deck for that, taking a close look at the place through his telescope, remarking that from the view of the numbers on the ramparts it had a sizable garrison, which would make it a hard place to capture should the need arise. Against that, at the foot of the bay, lay a long sandy beach, ideal for landing troops, which the master was busy sketching.
"Mr. Pearce,
I think we must test the defences if Neam's efforts are to be of any use. Please take us inshore a trifle."
Sails trimmed and rudder down, the ship swung in towards the midpoint of the entrance to the bay, where the darker hue of the water indicated increased depth, though a leadsman was casting in the chains to ensure that they did not ground. HMS Weasel began to lose some of her way as the wind, on the beam, was eased by the high hills, and it was not long before a pair of the shore-based cannon essayed the range, sending great plumes of water shooting up well ahead of the bowsprit. It was only luck that had Pearce looking deeper into the bay, where he saw a buoy with a rope attached, and what seemed like a set of flags at intervals halfway to the shore, the furthest of which they were inside. There was as well a pennant-carrying cutter, the cloth streaming out to show the strength of the wind. Could those flags indicate a range less than the maximum, working on the principle that even the best trained eye had difficulty with distance at sea? "Would they fire short to draw us in, sir?" Pearce asked, then added when Benton glared at him, "May I draw your attention to that buoy, sir, and that cutter?" Benton obliged, and the sight had him dropping his telescope. "Bring us about!" "All hands to wear ship!" Pearce shouted. The proof of the notion was proved as soon as the men ran to the falls to bring the ship back onto a reverse course. They, too, were being observed through telescopes, and by gunners who knew to the inch their range. The ramparts of the citadel were wreathed in smoke as the entire battery fired, and they could see a dozen huge black balls arcing through the air to straddle the ship, sending up enough water to windward to soak everyone on deck. "Mr. Pearce!" cried Neam, pointedly ignoring his captain. "Let us use the wind!" He did not understand, and he was acutely aware of the fact, but neither, it seemed, did Benton. Fortunately, Neam did not wait for orders. He had the hands sheet home as soon as the northerly breeze would give them better forward motion. Pearce now comprehended the calculation that any movement was better than the static position of coming right round to sail out of the bay. This proved by the shot that he was sure landed in the waters they had just vacated. They were now sailing towards that flag-holding buoy. "Permission to sink that cutter, sir?" he asked Benton. The nod in reply was slow in coming, or at least it seemed so, even if it was only a couple of seconds till he could shout, "Man the starboard cannon!" The guns were run out all right, with flintlocks fixed on, and the sight of their muzzles was enough to send off as fast as they could row the men oaring the boat. But they did not fire because the gunner had no charges filled, and by the time he did and the powder monkeys had got them to the gun captains, it was too late. The only positive being that the artillerymen from Calvi had ceased to waste powder and shot, as they were now beyond their reach, heading for the eastern part of the bay. "Bring us about again, Mr. Pearce," said Benton, "but out of range this time." The way it was said seemed to imply that going closer inshore had been his fault. He half thought of protesting, but reckoned it not to be worth the effort. Was it Benton's fault that there were no cartridges ready to fire the guns? Pearce did not know, but he was determined it would not happen again. Another, more forceful conversation with the gunner reinforced the notion of how much he loved his cannon, but created a distinct impression that he loved them too much to see them discharged, and was the type to see the proper place for powder as in the barrel, where it could be easily accounted for. He moaned that fixing the flintlocks had scratched the blacking, and asked that his gunner's mates could be put to making them pristine again. So much, Pearce thought, for getting close and blasting away. But surely, guns, we must be ready at any time for a fight. What if that corvette in Calvi was properly rigged and had decided to pursue us? "We're as ready as we need be," he replied, bending his crooked face to one side. "Stands to reason, sir, that if we see an enemy, we has time to do the necessary well afore they close." Mr. Digby approved of this? "Mr. Digby never inquired about cartridges, seeing we was with the fleet. What would be the point?" Pearce had to struggle to control his impatience, and he suspected, even with his lack of experience, that the man he was temporarily replacing would have been just as upset. Hate Ralph Barclay he might, but his example was the one to follow. Regular exercise with the odd discharge, so that his gunners knew their task. "Please have powder ready for the guns at all times. Who knows, we might wake up one morning to find that an enemy has got close enough to sink us."
"The captain I will deal with." "What weight of charge, Your Honour?" Unable to say what or why, Pearce just answered, "The maximum." He left the gunner mumbling about muzzles being blown asunder as he made his way back on deck and lifted himself onto the bulwark, hanging onto a backstay. Beneath him the sea was blue and clean, and he wondered if they would ever anchor so he could have a swim. Off the starboard beam lay the green-brown island, rocky promontories now mixed with long, blonde and sandy beaches backed by rising ridges of crag-topped mountains, with a faint smell of myrtle and pines to mix with the tang of salt on the wind, just as Boswell had described it to a young and impressionable boy. He longed to go ashore and see if he could find anyone who knew or could remember James Boswell. To hear him tell, Dr. Johnson's biographer was something of an idol on Corsica. He had become an intimate of the local leader, Pasquale Paoli, and helped him in his attempt to eject the French from the island. But then Adam Pearce had always described Boswell as a man who cast himself in a good light. He also insisted that Samuel Johnson, whom Adam had met many times, had never said half the things Boswell attributed to him. "Mr. Pearce?" He looked down to Mr. Neame. "I was wondering, sir, if you was going to put the hands through practice with boarding weapons. 'Tis the day for it, according to Mr. Digby's list." Pearce smiled. "Am I allowed to join in?" "Well, I ain't never heard of an officer doing so, but I don't reckon it would be a cause for mutiny if he did." "So be it, Mr. Neame, and let's have the mids on deck, and I will teach them how to properly use a sword." They passed a pleasant hour as they passed an empty bay with a town called Porto at its base, and because the forecastle was small, instruction had to be given in relays, which had the effect of bringing him into close contact with the crew, his only stricture to stop them indulging too heavily in the use of their weapons. Pikes, cudgels, dummy tomahawks and cutlasses made of wood, but still enough in weight to cause harm. With the mids he showed caution with a sword in his hand, for he had been taught by experts, his prowess acknowledged by those with whom he crossed wooden blades. Not that he overwhelmed an opponent. The object was to point out to them their lack of proficiency, not to show off. "I am curious, Mr. Pearce, where you learned your skill?" asked Neame as they ate their dinner. He could have said anything, but the truth would be best. "There is an army barracks in Paris called Les Invalides. I went there for instruction in both swordsmanship, shooting, and riding." "Paris," declared the purser through a mouthful of salted beef and sauerkraut, as though it was some kind of mortal sin. "Yes, Mr. Ottershaw. I spent more than 2 years there until the beginning of this year and the start of the present war." There was a temptation to go on, to tell them all, even how pleasant the French capital had been, if you ignored the smells that were the affliction of every city, still full of elegant and interesting people. To tell what it was like to be a young man growing up surrounded by that, his entry to salon society guaranteed because of the esteem in which his father was held as a radical and honest man. But then he would also have to describe how it changed, how the spiral of decline began that led to the present mayhem, and to the consequences his father suffered for being as truthful with those who took power. That was not a place John Pearce wanted to go, so he changed the subject. "I believe the next harbour we raise will be Ajaccio." Chapter 23. Ajaccio looked a dull and uninteresting place, with a small fort in a sorry state of repair, and no shipping bar fishing boats off the beaches, so they headed on south. Putting up their helm, they sailed through the Bouche de Bonifacio, but on a wind that was now dead foul, and reinforced by the tunnel effect of the narrow straits between Corsica and Sardinia, dominated by forbidding rocky escarpments, and a fortress similar in design to that of Calvi. That changed as they cleared the east of the islands, sailing inshore of Les Îles Lavezzi. Judging by the number of boats, good fishing ground lay between the islands and the high southern cliffs, and sick of salted beef and pork, Pearce sent off Harbin in a boat to purchase some fish from the tiny smacks that seemed reluctant to come close to a strange warship. "And see what they know of matters on the island, Harbin." "What do they speak, sir, the locals?" "According to an old friend of my father's, no language known to man. The island has been Greek, Carthaginian, Roman, Genoese, and finally it was bought by the French, who are not much loved by the original Corsicans."
Try a jabbing finger." The 8-oared cutter was obviously less of a threat, and after a long, hard pull, and what seemed like a lot of talking and arm-waving, the boy returned with enough fish for both the wardroom, the gunroom, and Benton's dinner. But Harbin brought more than just food. Without any knowledge of the Corsican tongue, he had managed to extract some startling news. "Sir, they convince me that a French warship is moored in the bay to the north, which I think they call Porto Vecchio, though the tongue was so barbarous I cannot be sure. It seems that she's not manned. The fishermen indicated that the crew are ashore." "There is an anchorage by that name, Mr. Pearce," said Neame, who had been studying the charts of the east coast. "Golfo di Porto Vecchio in the Italian, a deep bay and a port that goes back to ancient times, though not, I suspect, of much use now." "How did they manage to convince you of this?" Harbin's explanation, related with an excited air, took nearly as long as the original telling. The fishermen had drawn the coastline with wetted fingers, pointed north with much simulation of banging guns and waving of their small anchor, and repeated the name over and over again. Pearce could see the way Harbin's mind was working. The boy saw adventure, saw himself leaping over enemy bulwarks, sword in hand. But it was not his decision to believe or disbelieve what he had been told, or that of his temporary premier. "This is information, Mr. Harbin, that has to be reported to the captain." Which it duly was, to a man who seemed burdened by the information. Harbin was dismissed, leaving Pearce alone with Benton. "If this is true, and there is an unmanned French warship there, what are we to do?" "It is up to you, sir, to decide the best course of action." "I would value your opinion, Mr. Pearce." Why did he feel he was being asked to take, or at the very least share, responsibility? Was it something in Benton's orders, which he had been very reluctant up till now to fully communicate? "I think, sir, that no opinion can be advanced until we have seen what is and what is not accurate. With a trio of tongues to choose from, young Mr. Harbin might have got the whole thing wrong." Benton stared at his temporary second-in-command for a long time, his bloated face expressionless. "Please ask Mr. Neame to give us an estimate of how long that will be." "On this wind, Mr. Pearce, a true levanter, I reckon we will raise Porto Vecchio well before last light." His calculation was close, but with the sun having dipped behind the central Corsican mountains, throwing the whole eastern coastline into shadow, it was too near twilight to be fully certain of what they observed. But there was a ship, a sloop slightly larger than their own, of 14 guns, moored in a small, hill-enclosed bay to the north of the main approach to Porto Vecchio, and no sign of activity could be seen, either on her decks or between ship and shore. "Would it be a good idea to send in a boat, sir?" asked Pearce. For once Benton spoke as a normal human being, no growl, no disdain, and Pearce realized that he appeared to be completely sober. "That would only serve to alert anyone either on the ship or ashore. No, Mr. Pearce, we must make our decisions based on what we can now perceive." They stayed hove to, telescopes trained on the silent and still ship and the sloping hills that surrounded the bay, until the light faded completely and twinkling lanterns could be seen from the town itself, at the deepest part of the gulf, a good mile away. At this point, Benton, having seen his own ship's lanterns ignited, invited Pearce to join him in his cabin, that after issuing an order to the master. "Mr. Neame, set us back on our previous course. I would wish anyone watching us to see us sailing away northwards." Sat either side of his desk, Benton did not speak for a full minute, and when he did, his voice was low and muted. "My orders were quite specific, Mr. Pearce, and I am going to share them with you. I am not to indulge in any action which threatens the ship, or to chase after anything I might see as a potential prize. I am to reconnoitre the island, look out for suitable fleet anchorages, and report back to Admiral Hotham." "Which presents an awkward dilemma." "Precisely. Yet here we have before us what seems like a tempting prospect, an enemy vessel seemingly unmanned. Would I be forgiven for passing up such an opportunity?" Since Pearce declined to answer, Benton went on, "I think not. I doubt your orders anticipated such a possibility, sir."
"That is true."
Another long silence followed, until Benton said,
"Do you not find it strange that a warship is so moored and without a crew?"
"I think what has happened in Toulon, sir, tells us that these are strange times. There could be any number of reasons for the lack of a crew in a climate in which loyalties are uncertain. They may have deserted."
"I dare not take Weasel right into the bay, Mr. Pearce, for fear that without charts I might run her aground. But I have the added complication of having no marines on board, which is a limiting factor in a cutting-out expedition."
Benton looked really glum, a man damned if he did and damned if he did not. But Pearce was also damned if he was going to say so, for it seemed clear that was what the captain was looking for, words that would make up his mind, but also words that could be quoted in his defence if he faced censure. Pearce knew that Benton would have to cut out that ship. Advancement in King George's navy did not come from sailing on reconnaissance, and disobedience was always a second cousin to success with a nation that loved their wooden walls. Take that sloop, and he would be hailed throughout the fleet. Leave it, and heads would shake in wonderment, perhaps even the powdered wigs of senior admirals.
"I must put myself in Admiral Hotham's place," said Benton.
"Admiral Hood's as well," Pearce replied. He had said that without giving the notion much thought, but it had an electrifying effect on Benton, who slapped a decisive hand on the table.
"Hood would not hesitate, would he?"
The implication that Hotham might was telling, but best left unsaid. Suddenly Benton was all animation, a man from whom a burden had been completely lifted by the mere thought of approval from the Commander-in-Chief.
"Mr. Pearce, I want us off the bay at first light with the boats ready and over the side. We will come upon them, stern lanterns out, and hope they suppose us gone. You will take the jolly boat and Mr. Harbin, and carry out an assault over the stern. I will take the cutter and come aboard over the bows. Mr. Neame and the other two mids can have charge of our ship."
There was a temptation to dampen Benton's sudden enthusiasm with an observation that it was not a captain's job to lead such an assault. But then, if Benton did not, Pearce would have to, and he felt that with his lack of experience that was probably a bad idea. It was only much later, when it was too late to say anything that would not sound like an expression of cowardice, that John Pearce realized he should have declined to have anything to do with the affair. What was he doing, putting his person at risk? The crew, from mids through warrants to seamen, had been waiting with bated breath for a decision, and when it came it was clear they were pleased, for a ship like that 14-gun sloop, taken whole, was certain to be brought into the service, so there was money to be made. The hours of darkness were spent sharpening knives and cutlasses, in sorting out who would go over the stern with Pearce and who would assault their quarry over the bows. But it was reckoned that muskets would be a bad idea, an encumbrance to men unused to them, though pistols would be allowed. The activity stopped Pearce from dwelling on what might happen, for as the Premier he was kept busy organising everything from the issue of weapons to the sailing of the ship. Ghosting along, yards braced right round, Neame kept their speed in check so as to arrive at their destination just before dawn. It was a clear night with a half-moon in the sky, which at sea tended to look like full daylight, but it was hoped that any lookout posted on the rocky hills surrounding the bay would be too tired to pay proper attention in the last hour before dawn. They sailed slowly into the bay under topsails, backing them to slow progress. The tide, only a few feet in the Mediterranean, was still rising, so the master could let her drift in slowly and moor when action had been joined. This way they would avoid attracting attention either by the noise or the phosphorescent splash that a dropping anchor would create. The crew clambered into the boats as the eastern sky began to show the first trace of a clear dawn, with many a command to keep silent. Benton was sober, too, apparently not having touched a drink since the previous day, and Pearce had to admit a degree of excitement, and wondered at it. The boats formed up and headed in towards the land, rowing slowly and quietly. As the light increased, they saw the outline of the mast-tops emerging in the gloom to form a silhouette above the dark backdrop of the surrounding hills. No lights appeared, No shout announced their approach, and it looked as though the information Harbin had gathered was correct. Benton's arm waved and the boat split up, he going to the bow, Pearce to the stern. Still no shout came to warn of their approach, and Pearce, who had been tense, began to relax. He heard the faint scrape of Benton's boat as it touched, and in the increasing light he could see the sailors swarming aboard, and soon he too was leading his men over the taffrail, seemingly without anyone aware of their presence. The sun hit the horizon, a gold sliver that turned to the top arc of a fiery orb, spreading a golden glow as he and Harbin walked across to join Benton. The captain turned to him, his eyes glowing in the increasing light.
"The ship is deserted, not even an anchor watch. They must all be sleeping ashore. I've never heard of such luck. Let's cut the cable and get some men aloft."
Pearce was never quite sure which came first, the crack of the shot or the way the side of Benton's face seemed to explode. He was aware, as the captain was whacked over, of the musket balls around him, whistling through the morning air. He heard voices shouting for the cable to be cut, and he felt the rush of men as they made for the ratlins to run aloft and let go the sails. But he did not move, because in shock his feet seemed stuck to the deck. Moments passed as he saw the boats pulling back to their mothership in panic, and another volley cracked in his ear, which dragged his gaze away from Benton's shattered head, the body crumpled on the deck, one good eye staring straight ahead in death. Turning, he saw the hillsides surrounding the ship dotted with the puffs of smoke from dozens of muskets. And then a cannon boomed, creating a much greater cloud of billowing black, and the yards were swept with grape-shot. Men who had been climbing to let fall the sails were swept from the yards and plunged screaming either onto the deck or into the water alongside. The rest froze, trying to use what they could to shield themselves from another salvo. It was a trap. They had been waiting for them, allowing them to come aboard before opening fire, and while he and Harbin had been targets as they stood there, very obvious in their blue coats, most of the execution had taken place aloft, as well as with a party trying to cut the forward anchor cable. Pearce came alive and shouted for everyone to get themselves and any wounded down behind the inshore bulwark, with one fellow close to a hatch diving below. He then crawled along the side of the ship, past the bowsed cannons and the cowering men, to the bows. 2 were dead, lying with their axes in their hands, but Pearce could see that they had done good service before being shot. The cable was nearly through, and he shouted at the remaining pair, "We've got to cut that through!" That got a knowing look at the 2 dead bodies, one that silently imparted the notion that, it being suicide, if he wanted the cable cut, he had better stand up and get on with it. Yet it was the obvious solution. They had deliberately come in on the top of the tide, and it was about to turn. If they could cut that cable, and the one securing the stern, they might drift out of the bay, slowly, certainly, but if they kept their heads down, perhaps they would survive. Aware that whatever happened had to be coordinated, he crawled back along the deck to the stern. Harbin sat below the bulwark, and Pearce looked into his face, recognizing in the boy's expression a wish to be told what to do from the man who was now in command. That knowledge partly explained the sweat Pearce felt on his brow, the other being more prosaic. The sun was now fully up, and it was beginning to get warm. The muskets were trying to pick off the remaining sailors in the rigging, while their only thought was to get down to the safety of the deck. Every time they moved, the muskets banged and another volley swept over their heads. It seemed to him when one weapon fired, they all did, that there was no one in control, and that gave Pearce his idea, though he knew that it took no cognizance of that damned grape-shot-firing cannon, which made him hesitate. But since there was no alternative he could think of, it had to be risked. "Harbin, I'm going up to the bows, where I'm going to tell them to stand up and chop at the cable till it parts. I will allow 3 swings of their axes and get them under cover again. As we go down, get your men to get up and hack away. The same number, 3 cuts and down again. That will deny them time to take proper aim. Understand?"
"Aye, aye, sir."
And if they have shifted the aim of that cannon, thought Pearce, one of us is likely to die. He scurried back to the bows, stopping halfway to shed his coat, and gave his orders, waiting till another volley swept the rigging. Trembling slightly, he stood with his sailors, who got in 2 good hacks and a feeble third before he commanded them to get down, just in time to avoid a fusillade. in his heart thanking Providence for the lack of cannon fire. At the stern, a now coatless Harbin stood up, and his men did the same, and still the cannon stayed silent, ducking down at the right moment, thus allowing Pearce and his party to go again. The first swing parted the thick forward cable, so now it was only secured at the stern, and Pearce realized Harbin would have to be quick, or the ship would start to swing round. Stern on to the shore, they would be exposed to the fire from the hillsides with no protection. "Come on, Mr. Harbin!" he yelled. Pearce admired the way the boy obliged, even though he must have known the ruse would not work a second time, knew that the chances of that cannon remaining silent were slim. He stood with his men, and regardless of the shots whizzing around, fortunately only muskets, encouraged them as they hacked away. One sailor went down before the cable parted, but there was one positive. The men in the rigging had taken advantage of the respite to get back on deck. With both cables cut, Pearce waited for the ship to start drifting. But nothing happened. He couldn't understand it. The prize was as stationary as it had been before. Harbin shouted, and looking towards the stern, Pearce saw him pointing aloft. He squinted against the glare of the sky, seeing nothing to justify the call, as one of the crew, who he recognized as one of the gunner's mates, emerged from below and crawled towards him, getting himself to safety just as a well-aimed musket ball hit the planking behind his feet. Clearly the enemy had a weapon trained on the space between the hatchway and the side. "There's nothing to drink below, and the magazine is empty, Your Honour." "What?" "The magazine, Your Honour. There's no gunpowder. They'll be shot in the locker, but we can't turn their guns on them, since we have nothing to fire them with." The thought had not even occurred to Pearce, for which he cursed himself. Harbin shouted a second time, a hand again pointing towards the top of the mizzenmast, and finally Pearce saw what he was on about. The gunner's mate saw it too, as Pearce looked to the mainmast to see what Harbin had spotted was replicated there. "The bastards have cables from the mastheads to the shore, Your Honour." Cutting the cables had not freed the ship, and it would not move until those cables aloft were cut as well. Aware that he had little notion of how to solve that, Pearce sat back, leaning against the side of the ship as Harbin crawled down to join him. "Do you have any orders, sir?" "Orders?" Pearce replied with a grim smile. "We need to get a party together under someone reliable to get aloft and cut those cables on the masts." "I'll go myself, sir," said Harbin. Was it bravery or stupidity that made the boy volunteer for something so deadly? Pearce did not know. He only knew that it was admirable, just as he knew that if he ordered the men aloft, they would go. And why had that cannon not fired again? It seemed obvious. They knew ashore what had to be done, had probably reset their aim, and were just waiting for them to attempt it. "Getting killed is not part of your duties, Mr. Harbin, and we have already seen what happens to anyone caught in the rigging." He explained his thoughts about the cannon, then added, "We will need to contrive some other scheme. Perhaps we can get our boats back and get clear." "I fear they would suffer many casualties, sir, just to get to us, as we would going over the side." "Which we will also do if we stay put. The sun is rising, and I am informed there is nothing to drink aboard, this while the route of escape is on the other side of the ship. Our opponents have thought this out well." He knew it would be better to get the men below. At least there they would be safe, but there was a risk in just getting them down, as well as the very obvious fact that getting them back on deck in numbers would be even more risky. And if he could not do that, he could not do anything. Rack his brains as he might, Pearce could see no other way out of this trap than by cutting the cables aloft, and that could not be done from below. Did he have the right to get killed the half-dozen hands it would take? Not unless he risked his own life. There was no way John Pearce could order men to climb the shrouds with axes, the only thing that could save them, while he sat safe behind his bulwark. He too would have to go, knowledge of which concentrated his mind. Could he contrive a distraction of some kind? He was gnawing on that when he heard a loud bang offshore, saw a ball arc over his head, which he followed, risking musket fire to see a shot strike the hill face. Weasel had joined in. Neame had anchored her fore and aft and run out the guns. Would it answer, or would it take too long, for the deck was getting damned hot? If they could not move, they would have to stay here all day in the sweltering glare while Neame traded gunfire. They then needed a cloudy, moonless night. Unlikely, since right now there was not a cloud in the sky. And that would only help if the men ashore made no attempt to retake the ship. Weasel fired again and again, seeking to dislodge the musketeers from the hillside. But given they were well concealed and he was having to fire over the French ship, it was a forlorn hope. But the real problem was that cannon and its grape-shot. Bodies lay around the deck while another was hanging from the rigging, and that took no account of those who had hit the water. Benton's corpse was crumpled in the centre of the quarterdeck like a broken doll, his blood, now dark like the wine he'd been so fond of, staining several yards of the planking. Along the bulwark the wounded were being made as comfortable as possible, which was, judging by the moaning, not comfortable enough. Harbin joined him again. "I've had an idea, sir. If we could rig some way of signalling to the master, we could direct his fire." "Explain." Harbin grinned, all freckles and teeth, then crawled away. He managed to get to the signal locker by the binnacle without attracting attention, and there he set to trying to sort out the flags so that he could compose signals that Neame would understand. This took quite some time, and the heat, the silence, added to the fact that he had been up all night, was extremely enervating. Pearce closed his eyes and was daydreaming of a cool dip in the sea when he was alerted by the sound of more shots, caused by Harbin running to the signal halyard, having sorted out which flags he could use. The boy was busy, using the mast itself as a cover, bending on a message, one that the master, with the aid of the signal book, might understand. He extended the halyard lines to reach into the protected bulwarks and then, flags under his arms, dived for shelter alongside his superior. "All's ready, sir. The first signal will read, 'Can you understand our signals?' Might I suggest, sir, that our first task should be to get their fire to silence that cannon?" "That seems the obvious course, Mr. Harbin. You see to the signals, and I will deal with the cables." "Right, sir. I will ask them to acknowledge with the signal gun." He hoisted his first message, which attracted a lot of useless gunfire from the shore. Harbin left it for a moment and hoisted another, on sight of which Weasel fired a gun. They had communication, so there followed a complicated running up and down of flags which made no sense at all to Pearce, but a quick glance offshore showed him that Weasel had shifted her position to get a clear shot at the hillsides. Pearce issued his orders, and at the right moment called out, setting him and his party running towards the mast. As soon as they got there, they flung themselves on the deck, this as a great swathe of grape-shot passed over their heads, after which Pearce had them scurrying back to safety. After a pause there was a rolling broadside from Weasel, followed by another, then a third, which brought forth a great clanging sound which echoed round the bay, that in its turn followed by a faint cheer from out at sea. Harbin, who had been raising and lowering his head throughout, called to say that the cannon, having given its position away by firing, had, he thought, been dislodged by the sloop's long nines. The possibility was encouraging, but that did nothing as regards the musketry, and Pearce was reluctant to expose his men to that either. "Mr. Harbin, is it possible to signal Weasel to load with grape?" "I can try, sir." While the midshipman set about that, Pearce called to the gunner's mate, who had told him about the lack of drink and gunpowder. "Are there any hammocks below?" A quick crawl got the man below, with another musket ball scarring the same part of the deck as previously. "Don't come back," Pearce yelled. "Just shout." The wait was only a minute, but it seemed longer before a rolled-up hammock was thrown out, that too attracting a single shot from the shore, this as Pearce reached out for his coat, relieved that the notion he had had seemed a sound one. "Right, lads. What we are going to do is make a dummy that our enemies will take to be a sailor, and since it needs to be perceived to be an idiot, it better be an officer." It was a feeble joke, but it got a laugh. "We must find something to fly the dummy so as to draw their fire. That, Mr. Harbin, is when we want grape-shot from Weasel, as they are reloading. It may not kill them, they could be too well concealed, but it will keep their heads down and spoil their aim, and by the time they've been swept twice, I hope we shall have cut ourselves free." "Is there enough in the tide to take us out of danger?" asked Harbin. "What makes you doubt it?" asked Pearce, unsure of the answer. "As you know, the Mediterranean don't rise and fall much, sir, only a couple of feet, and with no steerage way, We can't keep her beam onto the shore." Pearce looked aloft, to where the sails were clewed up, realizing that instead of risking only a proportion of the boarding party, he was going to have to risk them all. "Then we must also send men up to drop the topsails. Those left on deck are going to have to sheet them home, and some poor soul is going to have to manage the wheel."
"Might be a job for an idiot, sir," suggested a voice.
"Then I'd best volunteer," Pearce replied, to a gale of laughter, which had him wondering if they could hear that ashore, and if they could, what they would make of it. It took time to signal Weasel, time enough to allow them to fully dress the dummy as a naval lieutenant. It looked like nothing close to, but from a distance it might pass for a man. Nothing but use would tell, and they could only hope that Neame fully understood what was required with the gunnery. Harbin waved that he was ready, and the crew crouched beside the useless guns, preparing to leap for the ratlins. One man had the dummy tied to a whip, one he had found that went all the way to the upper yards. Pearce nodded. The man pulled, the hammock rose, and a fusillade of shots cracked over them, none of them striking the dummy. "Now!" shouted Pearce. The men ran as fast as they could, scrabbling for their footholds in the ratlins as they raced aloft. Mentally, making his way towards the wheel, Pearce went through the loading of a musket. He had just levelled the gun in his mind's eye and was ducking down when Weasel opened up with a blast of grape, and suddenly the air was alive with the whistling sound of hundreds of small balls. Shots flew from the hillsides, but faced with a salvo of deadly grape and ricocheting rock, they flew wide. Within a minute the men were in the tops, letting go the sails as their mates went even higher. Pearce moved from safety and ran to grab the wheel, feeling just as exposed, and waited until he could see that the upper yardsmen had cut them free from the restraining cables, which fell from the masts with a loud splash. This, while those left on deck stood to sheet the sails home. He was congratulating himself on getting away without more casualties when a sailor fell from the yards into the sea, just at the moment the sloop had life. "Get a rope to that fellow, quick!" he called to the wounded men, some of whom had the ability to move. Humbled by the way they obeyed, hobbling to the task and managing to get a line into the fellow's outstretched hand. There was not much wind, but the sloop was taking it and getting under way, groaning and creaking, towing the man in the water. But still puffs of powder smoke were erupting from the rocks, braving the continued fire from Weasel. Muskets had a poor range, no more than 100 yards at best if the user wanted accuracy, and Pearce reckoned they must be getting beyond that now, so it would have to be a very lucky shot that would hit anyone now. When it did, jarring his arm, the shock killed any pain. That would come later. He looked down to see, through his torn blue coat, where the bullet had cut through his shirt and grazed his right arm. He also saw the bright blood well up from the wound, but he took a tight grip, and the ship stayed steady, seen out of the bay by the sound of loud cheering. Arm-bandaged, Pearce sat in Benton's cabin, writing a report on the action, an absolute necessity and a task best carried out when everything was fresh in the mind. The owner of the quill in his hand was lying on the deck, already sewn in canvas, with some joker suggesting that it should be weighted with his store of wine rather than a cannonball. The jest was not cruelly meant, and it had some truth to it when Pearce discovered just how many bottles and pipes Benton had brought along. 10 dozen of his blackstrap unconsumed, and 2 pipes of port bought in Lisbon, and that was without his supply of brandy. It was just the natural morbidity of seamen, and in truth, too many of their mates had died or taken a wound in that bay. Too many lay alongside Benton on the deck for the men not to be downcast and in need of some humour. Alongside was the ship they had taken, called Mariette, with the Weasel's warrant officers crawling all over her to establish her condition, her guns, stores, and the like, all guessing at what she might be worth. "Mr. Harbin," he said as the midshipman entered. "Sir." Pearce did not reply at once. Instead, he reread what he had written, particularly about this young man. Finally, he looked up at the midshipman standing rigid before him. "Mr. Harbin, I want you to take command of our prize and ask Mr. Neame to provide you with a decent master's mate. Choose what crew you need to sail her in safety, though you are to stay in our wake." The boy seemed to physically swell. "Thank you, sir." I want you to know that I have said in my report that without your intelligence and your efforts, we would all have either died or been taken prisoner. Now Harbin blushed and began to protest that it was not true. Please, Mr. Harbin, cease your protests and go and take command of your ship. The two sloops sailed in line ahead, up the east coast of Corsica, the flag of the Union flying above the tricolour on the mainmast of Mariette. Abreast of the fortified town of Bastia in the early afternoon, having surveyed the good landing beaches to the south, Mr. Neame had a request to the man walking on the windward side of the quarterdeck, who had just issued orders to hold their course, the anchorage off the town being empty of shipping. "I'd like your permission to fire a signal gun, sir." Responding to a quizzical look, the master added, pointing to yet another citadel and gun-bristling fortress, "We would not want them French buggers in Bastia not to see the arrangement of Mr. Harbin's flags." Pearce thought of the crooked-faced gunner and his miserly husbanding of powder, who had been fussing like a mother hen over the state of his guns after the depredations caused by Neame's actions, blacking the muzzles and painting the trunnions. The chance to beard him was too good to miss. He looked at the shore, where there seemed little sign of any activity. "I think a broadside would be in order, Mr. Neame. I am given to understand that people in hot climates sleep at this time of day. Let us make sure that their slumbers are disturbed." No balls were fired, just powder, and Harbin responded to the loud bangs by dipping the tricolour and jerking the Union Jack. As the smoke swept aft, Neame asked, "I wonder what they will make of this in Toulon, Mr. Pearce." Pearce grinned. "That, Mr. Neame, makes two of us." You have been listening to An Awkward Commission. It was written by David Donachie and read by Peter Wickham.